In this video, you are going to hear about 20 real crimes that remain unsolved, even after decades. Strange disappearances, unexplained deaths, and scenes that defy all logic. Cases that, to this day, remain an absolute mystery. Make yourself comfortable, and get ready to step into the unknown. The Isdal Woman. On November 29, 1970, in a shadowy corner of the Isdalen Valley, on the outskirts of Bergen, Norway, a father and his two daughters were walking along a rarely used trail when they noticed a strange smell. It did not take them long to discover the source. Among the blackened stones, almost as if the ground had recently burned, lay the charred body of a woman. She was lying in a strangely tidy position, with her arms bent upward in a posture more suited to rest than disaster. Her face, unrecognizable due to the burns, revealed nothing. There were no screams around, no signs of struggle, not even a clear clue of how she had ended up there. And yet, that moment marked the beginning of one of the most baffling criminal mysteries of the 20th century. The Bergen police immediately faced a scene that defied logic. The woman's body, though burned, displayed details that were impossible to ignore. Her clothes appeared to have been soaked in gasoline, and beneath her lay remains of sleeping pills, a broken bottle, and a set of strangely arranged personal items. 2 empty liquor bottles, about 10 scattered sleeping tablets, a partially burned passport. None of it made sense. And the most disturbing part was that all the labels on her clothing had been carefully cut off. There was no trace left that could identify her origin, her name, or her movements. The autopsy did not clarify much, although it revealed sinister nuances. The woman had ingested at least 50 pills of the drug phenamol, a powerful barbiturate, but the burns had been so intense that it was impossible to determine precisely whether she died from the fire or from poisoning. What was clear was that she had still been alive when she was burning. The soot in her lungs proved it. To burn to death, slowly and silently, in the middle of a frozen forest with no witnesses, an image that refuses to fade away. What began as a strange scene turned into a formless nightmare as the rest of the clues were examined. At Bergen's central train station, a suitcase belonging to the woman was discovered. Not one, but later, 2. Inside them were wigs, non-prescription glasses, knives, maps, and postcards of tourist spots. No documents bearing her name. No trace of identity. The suitcase also contained money in several currencies, makeup, elegant clothing, and a notebook with coded notes. It was as if this woman had lived permanently in disguise, as if she had gone through life erasing her tracks while weaving a labyrinth for anyone trying to follow them. With the discovery of the suitcases, a race began to reconstruct her steps. Using hotel records, witness testimonies, and surveillance at train stations, investigators were able to trace a sort of itinerary. The woman had traveled throughout Norway for weeks using various false names, all of them female, all vaguely European, all registered with passports that were never verified. Witnesses remembered her cold beauty, her reserved behavior, and a foreign accent that was difficult to place. Some thought she was French. Others swore she spoke German. No one knew for sure who she was, but all agreed on one thing: she did not want to be remembered. During her stay in Bergen, she lodged in modest hotels, always paying in cash. Sometimes she wore a wig, other times she showed up looking completely different. She constantly changed rooms, names, styles. She had no personal relationships, no visits. She observed more than she spoke. According to some testimonies, she seemed to always be looking over her shoulder, as if she were expecting something, or someone. She gave the impression of being on the run, but no one knew from what. The authorities published police sketches, facial reconstructions, even sent her fingerprints to Interpol. Nothing. No country recognized the woman. Her teeth showed advanced dental work, likely from Eastern or Southern Europe, which added a new layer of mystery. There were also traces of radiation on some of her personal belongings, sparking theories that bordered on the unbelievable. Some media began to suggest that she might have been a spy in the midst of the Cold War, perhaps a double agent who had been eliminated after completing her mission or being discovered. The Norwegian police, uncomfortable with the direction the rumors were taking, tried to close the case with a practical conclusion: suicide. But neither forensic data, nor testimonies, nor context supported such a simple version. Who commits suicide in a remote location after completely destroying their identity, after traveling for weeks pretending to be different people without leaving a single note? Why ingest sleeping pills if the final method was to be fire? Why place the objects carefully around her as if they were on display? Every detail seemed more like a message, a code, or a warning than an act of despair. Over the years, the case was abandoned by the police, but never by amateur investigators. In Norway, the mystery of the Isdal Woman remains alive in the collective memory, not only because of the disturbing nature of the crime, but because of what it represents: a black hole within a system that prides itself on order. In 2016, Norwegian journalist Marit Heigraf revived public interest in the case with a series of investigations that revealed previously unknown details. Thanks to isotope analysis of the woman's teeth, it was determined that she was likely born in a border region between Germany and France, which reinforces the theory that her accent confused those who heard her. More recently, in 2019, mitochondrial DNA analysis was applied to her exhumed remains, but the information was insufficient to establish a connection with any living relatives. Time had done its work. What remained of her were ashes, partial bones, and questions with no destination. Her grave, marked with a plaque that simply reads, "Unknown Woman," is often visited, not by those who knew her, but by those who sense in her story an echo of something larger, a missing presence still watching from the mist of the fjords. In her silence, the Isdal Woman left behind more noise than many who screamed for attention. Her story is a warning that even in an age obsessed with information, there are still impenetrable corners, and that sometimes the truth is not only buried, it is deliberately hidden, neatly folded, coded, burned almost to the point of vanishing, but not entirely. The murder of Arlis Perry. On the night of October 12, 1974, the campus of Stanford University was wrapped in the usual weekend calm, as students scattered between late-night study sessions, dorm room dinners, and short walks under the dim light of the street lamps. No one imagined that, while dry leaves crunched beneath the feet of the few who dared to wander the empty paths inside Memorial Church, a place built for reflection and contemplation, a scene bordering on the grotesque was unfolding. There, among colorful stained glass windows and old wooden pews, a crime was being committed that remains to this day a splinter embedded in the criminal history of the United States. Arlis Perry was a 19-year-old young woman who had just moved to California with her husband, Bruce. Newlyweds, they had arrived from North Dakota to begin a new chapter. He as a student at Stanford, she as a secretary in a law office. Their move had been recent enough that they had not yet formed social circles or fully established routines. That night, Arlis and Bruce had a minor argument outside Memorial Church. According to Bruce, she decided to go into the church to pray alone and clear her thoughts. It was an ordinary scene, one that under different circumstances no one would remember. But in this case, it would mark the last time Arlis Perry was seen alive. When Bruce returned hours later, he found the church closed and no sign of his wife. He assumed she had returned to the dormitory or was with a friend. He spent the night unaware that behind those walls, the darkness had not only enveloped the century-old architecture, but had also become the accomplice of a deeply disturbing scene. It was not until dawn that the church's custodian, upon opening the doors as he did every morning, made the discovery. Arlis's body lay near the altar. She was completely still, lying on her back, with a stony expression that remained even after death. The corpse had been arranged in a deliberately symbolic way. Her body was partially nude, with her torso exposed, and a long iron candlestick inserted into her chest. Her legs were spread, and in one of them, the killer had placed a ceremonial object. Her head rested on an improvised pillow made from her folded clothing, as if someone had wanted to mix brutality with a nearly theatrical staging. There were signs of strangulation and evidence that she had been beaten. But what most unsettled the investigators was not just the violence of the act, but the way everything seemed arranged to suggest a message, as if the death had been choreographed to represent something deeper than a random attack. From the very beginning, there was talk of rituals. The features of the scene, the symbolism of the location, the use of liturgical objects as weapons, and the positioning of the body all fit more with a staged execution than an impulsive murder. The idea that the young woman had fallen victim to a cult or to a crime motivated by dark beliefs began to gain ground in the media and in the minds of investigators. Even though there was no physical evidence linking the crime to esoteric groups, the context of the era favored that interpretation. The United States was experiencing a cultural fervor filled with social tensions, and the echoes of the crimes committed by Charles Manson and his followers still resounded strongly. The police questioned Bruce, who had been the last person to see her alive. His testimony remained consistent, without contradictions, and his movements were corroborated by third parties. There was no immediate reason to suspect him. They also interviewed the campus security guard, a man named Stephen Crawford, who reported that he had closed the church shortly after midnight without noticing anything unusual. He said he had made a routine patrol and had not seen or heard anything strange in the building. According to his version, the door had remained locked throughout the night, which implied that the killer must have been inside before it was closed or had entered later through some unregistered access point. However, the autopsy revealed something even more unsettling. Arlis had died around 2 or 3 in the morning. How could someone stay in a locked church for hours without being discovered? Or worse yet, how could someone enter without forcing the locks? The investigation stalled among these confusing details and the lack of conclusive evidence. For months, and even years, the case was the subject of speculation, from roaming serial killers to members of satanic cults. Some pointed to figures like David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, who years later would claim he knew details about the murder of Arlis Perry. Although his statements were never verified, they reignited the ritual theory. The case, however, was slowly frozen in the archives, like so many others. The lack of DNA, cameras, or accurate records condemned it to spend decades under a fog of silence and discomfort. Until, in 2018, something changed. Thanks to advances in forensic genealogy and new fingerprint analysis techniques, investigators decided to re-examine the physical evidence from the crime. That is when something came to light. A genetic match pointed directly to the church custodian, Stephen Crawford, the same man who had reported closing the church the night of the murder. When the police obtained a warrant to search his home and arrest him, they arrived too late. Crawford shot himself in the head before they could apprehend him. His suicide was not a formal confession, but it was enough for the authorities to consider him the perpetrator of the crime. However, the fact that for more than 40 years he had remained near the campus, working and living in apparent normality, raised more questions than answers. Why did he kill Arlis? Was it an impulsive attack or something meticulously planned? Did he act alone? Or was someone else involved in the scene that for years had been believed to be ceremonial? Many still resist accepting the official version. For some, Crawford was a convenient scapegoat who allowed a troubling case to be closed. For others, his reaction to the arrest is sufficient proof of guilt. The truth is that the most disturbing details of the crime remain unexplained. What motivated the brutality of the staging? Why would someone take the time to transform a murder into such a twisted symbolic display? It is in these silences where the mystery endures, where certainties dissolve and the crime becomes more than just a sum of forensic data. To this day, the story of Arlis Perry serves as a reminder that even in sacred spaces, where architecture invites calm and reflection, the darkest parts of the human soul can still break through. That a church, no matter how solemn it may seem, is not immune to violence. And that faith, youth, and innocence alone are not enough to stop the hand of someone who has already decided to kill. The girl JonBenét Ramsey. It was Christmas. The city of Boulder, in the state of Colorado, woke up quietly that morning of December 26, 1996. The lights were still blinking on the porches, the streets were covered with a thin layer of snow, and the houses remained silent after the excitement of the previous night. For the Ramsey family, however, that morning would mark the beginning of a tragedy that, despite the decades that have passed, remains shrouded in a veil of confusion, conflicting theories, and a persistent sense that something essential is still hidden beneath the surface. JonBenét Ramsey was 6 years old. She was a girl with a sweet face, big eyes, and a practiced smile. From a very young age, she participated in child beauty pageants, encouraged by her mother Patsy, a former beauty queen who had found in the competitions a mirror to project her past ambitions. JonBenét had become a miniature public figure. Her image appeared in brochures, home videos, and television reports. She lived in an environment of privilege and appearances, in a huge house adorned with everything money could buy. However, behind the perfect facade, something would break irreversibly that night. At 5:52 in the morning, Patsy Ramsey made a distressed call to 911. She said that her daughter had disappeared. She claimed to have found a ransom note on the stairs, handwritten, demanding a ransom of $118,000. The amount was strangely specific. It matched a recent bonus that John Ramsey, JonBenét's father, had received from his company. The note was written with melodramatic phrases, in a strange style, as if imitating the language of action movies or detective novels. It was nearly 3 pages long, something completely atypical for a real kidnapping. From the very first moment, something about the case felt unsettling. The investigators who arrived at the house did not treat it as a crime scene. Multiple people were allowed in and out, friends, neighbors, and curious visitors who came to support the family. Some of them walked everywhere, touched objects, and served coffee in the kitchen, unintentionally disturbing potential evidence. During the first hours, the priority was searching for a missing girl, not investigating a murder. That difference was crucial because everything that happened afterward was marked by that initial confusion. It was John Ramsey who, almost 8 hours later, discovered his daughter's body in the basement of the house. He found her inside a small room that looked more like a maintenance closet, with unpainted walls and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. JonBenét was wrapped in a white blanket. She had duct tape over her mouth, her hands tied, and a cord around her neck. There were clear signs of strangulation, as well as injuries suggesting sexual assault. There was blood, but in a small amount, and later reports would indicate that the cause of death was a combination of asphyxiation and a strong blow to the head, possibly caused by a blunt object like a flashlight. The scene was brutal, but also strangely organized. The garrote used to strangle her had been made from a rope and the handle of a paintbrush taken from inside the same house. The ransom note had also been written on a page torn from a notepad found in the Ramseys' kitchen. The killer, whoever it was, had spent considerable time inside the house, using household items, writing unhurriedly, and placing the body with some care, as if trying to construct an alternative narrative to the crime. Theories began to multiply immediately. One part of public opinion pointed to an intruder. There was talk of a person who could have entered through a basement window known to be faulty. This line of thinking gained support among those who resisted imagining that parents could be responsible for something so atrocious. But this version had flaws. There were no outside footprints, no signs of forced entry, and the crime scene showed no evidence that someone had fled in a hurry. It seemed more like the work of someone who knew the house from the inside, who had free access, and who was not afraid of being discovered. The other theory, the most uncomfortable and persistent, pointed inside the family. Some investigators believed that the ransom note had been written by someone trying to divert attention, simulating a kidnapping to cover up an accidental death or an aggression that got out of hand. For years, it was speculated that Patsy might have reacted violently after a minor argument, or that JonBenét's brother, Burke, then 9 years old, could have hurt her unintentionally, and that their parents covered up what happened. But no conclusive evidence was ever found to definitively support those hypotheses. The case became a media circus. Photos of JonBenét dressed in pageant gowns and wearing makeup were broadcast endlessly. Television networks interviewed experts, lawyers, psychologists, and even psychics. Books were written, documentaries were produced, and every new detail seemed to feed more curiosity than understanding. Meanwhile, the Ramsey family lived under constant pressure, marked by public suspicion, interrogations, and the devastating loss of a daughter who was just beginning to live. Over time, the physical evidence began to deteriorate, or became subject to contradictory interpretations. The DNA samples found on JonBenét's underwear did not match anyone in the family, nor any profile in criminal databases. For some, that was the definitive proof that someone else had been there. For others, it was external contamination, perhaps from the garment's manufacturing process, or from the handling of the evidence. The doubt remained, and with it, the impossibility of closing the case satisfactorily. In the year 2008, after a more advanced forensic review, authorities publicly exonerated the Ramsey family. The district attorney acknowledged that the genetic evidence pointed in another direction, and that therefore neither John nor Patsy nor Burke were considered suspects. However, the debate did not cease. Many saw in that statement a way to end a legal conflict, but not necessarily a categorical assertion about what had happened in that house. Despite the official exoneration, the judgment of public opinion continued. Patsy Ramsey died in 2006 due to ovarian cancer. She passed away without ever being officially charged, but also without being cleared in the minds of those who followed the case passionately. John Ramsey continued searching for answers, occasionally appearing in interviews and working with private investigators. Burke, who grew up under a cloud of unjustified suspicion, gave a rare television interview in 2016, in which he defended his family's innocence, although his on-camera behavior sparked divided opinions. The murder of JonBenét Ramsey has not expired. Authorities still consider the case active. From time to time, new DNA analyses emerge, files are reviewed, or hypotheses arise attempting to shed light on a crime that should never have happened. But the truth, that truth that seems buried under layers of spectacle, omissions, and initial mistakes, remains elusive. The only certain thing is that a little girl died in an atrocious way inside her own home, on a night that was supposed to be one of celebration, and the whole world watched, unable to understand how something so delicate broke so brutally. The missing persons of Yosemite National Park. Yosemite, in the heart of California, is one of those natural gems that seem drawn from a world that existed before time. With valleys carved by glaciers, waterfalls crashing down with primitive force, ancient forests, and granite peaks that touch the sky, this national park has been, for over a century, a magnet for hikers, photographers, adventurers, and entire families who seek to lose themselves, quite literally, in a landscape that offers silence, grandeur, and an apparent total disconnection from human chaos. But amid that beauty, there is a statistic that does not appear in official brochures or on tourist maps or on the signs that advise not to feed the bears. Every year, dozens of people disappear in Yosemite without leaving a trace. Some are found, yes, but many others simply vanish. as if they dissolved among the trees. Speaking of disappearances in Yosemite means stepping into a realm where logic fades. This is not an isolated incident, nor a specific crime with a victim and a murderer. It is rather a disturbing pattern, a persistent trickle of cases with no clear explanation. People of different ages, backgrounds, physical conditions, and levels of outdoor experience enter the park and never come out. Sometimes their belongings are found miles away from where they were last seen. Other times their backpacks are intact, but their shoes are missing. Some bodies are found years later in places that had already been thoroughly searched by rescue teams. In certain cases, even with helicopters, tracking dogs, and cutting-edge technology, the signals abruptly end, as if they had entered a zone where the world no longer responds. One of the most unsettling stories is that of Stacy Ann Arlis, a 14-year-old girl who, in July 1981, was visiting the park with her father as part of a horseback riding group. They were staying in a remote area known as High Sierra Camps, a place with spectacular views. After arriving, Stacy decided to walk with her camera to a nearby spot where she could take some pictures. Her father saw her walk away, accompanied by an older man from the group. But after a few minutes, she continued alone. She never returned. The elderly man was later found, disoriented but unharmed. There was no trace of Stacy. The strange thing is that the terrain was open, without any obvious blind spots, and not far from the camp. Despite a massive search operation, her body was never found. It is as if the earth had swallowed her whole, without tracks, without noise, without witnesses. Another striking case is that of Timothy Barnes, an experienced hiker who disappeared in 2005 during an apparently simple route near Yosemite Creek. He was a well-prepared man, with a map, compass, provisions, and experience in high mountain trekking. He set out one morning intending to return before nightfall. He never came back. What baffled the rescuers was that his GPS signal showed an abrupt stop at a location with no cliffs or rivers. And from that point, nothing else. When they finally found his backpack, it was perfectly placed on a rock, with no signs of a struggle or visible damage. Inside were his documents, some food, untouched water, and a charged flashlight. Of Timothy, not a single hair. These are not isolated incidents. Over the past 30 years, more than 700 disappearances have been documented in national parks across the United States, and Yosemite tops the list. While many are attributed to natural causes such as accidents, animal attacks, or disorientation, a considerable number defy all conventional explanations. Some bodies appear in places illogically far from where they were searched. There are records of corpses found without clothes in snowy areas, with no signs of hypothermia, but also without physical trauma. Cases in which watches are still ticking, wallets remain untouched, but the individuals are dead in postures that suggest more of a mental collapse than a fight for survival. And what is even more disconcerting, many times forensic reports do not determine a conclusive cause of death. The official information on the subject is fragmented. The National Park Service does not maintain a consolidated public database on missing persons. Each case is filed separately, often under local jurisdiction, making it nearly impossible to trace a pattern unless one insists on searching. It was precisely that institutional void that led people like David Paulides, a former detective and writer, to start systematically compiling reports of missing persons in U.S. parks after hearing a park ranger express frustration about the number of unresolved cases. His book series, titled Missing 411, has documented hundreds of stories, many of them with disturbing details. Disappearances in front of witnesses, children found alive miles away in record time, adults discovered dead in vertical areas impossible to climb without specialized gear. Skeptics have accused Paulides of manipulating data or suggesting unfounded theories. However, even without the speculative content, the statistical pattern remains. Yosemite is a wild environment, yes, with dangerous animals, shifting weather, and remote zones. But search and rescue experts know that even under such conditions, there are elements that repeat when someone gets lost. Scattered personal items, visible tracks, some form of orientation, or signs of struggle. In many of these cases, all of that is missing. It is also curious how technology, far from clarifying the picture, has contributed to the mystery. On more than one occasion, the mobile phones of the missing persons remained on for days, yet their exact location could not be tracked. Some turned off suddenly in areas without coverage. Others stopped emitting signals for no clear reason. Personal cameras found showed the last photos as if nothing strange were about to happen. They are images of beautiful landscapes, clear skies, well-marked trails. Nothing suggests an imminent threat. And yet, the next chapter of those stories is emptiness. Some have suggested the possibility of serial abductors, organized groups hiding in the vastness of the park. Others, more inclined toward the esoteric, speak of portals, unexplained energies, or entities that feed on human loss. But even those who dismiss such ideas accept one disturbing reality. In Yosemite, there is a frequency of unexplained disappearances that exceeds any reasonable average. And what is most troubling is that, being federal natural spaces, jurisdiction and collaboration between agencies often hinder more than they help. What remains at the end of each of these stories is an accumulation of absences. Parents who stopped seeing their children, couples separated for a moment who never reunited, full backpacks that appear without their owner, and entire families who return to the park year after year looking for signs that never appear. There is an echo in Yosemite, a murmur that does not come from its waterfalls or the wind among the trees, but from those lives left in limbo, frozen at some point in the vastness, perhaps waiting for someone, someday, to find the missing piece. And until that happens, Yosemite will continue to be a paradise with a dark side, an immense beauty that holds within it one of the most persistent and baffling mysteries of modern American territory. The identity of Little Miss Nobody. On July 31st, 1960, on the outskirts of the desert in Congress, Arizona, a family walking through a dry and dusty area made a discovery that chilled the air under a scorching sun. What at first looked like a small pile of disturbed soil turned out to be an improvised grave. As they approached, they noticed the ground had been recently moved and something was protruding from the sand. Minutes later, Yavapai County officers were at the scene, and what they found would mark the beginning of one of the most painful mysteries in the criminal history of the United States. The partially buried body of a girl, unidentified, with no family in sight, and no trace to explain who she was, how she had gotten there, or why she had been buried in such a remote location. The girl was between 4 and 7 years old, according to the initial forensic estimate. She had been placed in the ground with a certain degree of care. Her fingernails were painted red. She wore a frilly white blouse, dark shorts, and sandals. She was barefoot, though the shoes were found nearby, placed together, as if someone had left them there deliberately. The body showed signs of sun exposure, and the extreme desert heat had sped up decomposition. There were no documents, no visible clues, and no one came forward to report her missing. With no name to be found, local police gave her a title that would echo for decades in reports, in old newspaper headlines, and on the headstones of unmarked graves. Little Miss Nobody. The discovery shocked the small community of Prescott and the entire region. In a time without social media, without interconnected databases, and without accessible DNA, identifying a body was no easy task. Authorities took fingerprints, distributed composite sketches, contacted police stations throughout the southwestern United States, and even made rudimentary facial reconstructions with forensic sculptors. But no missing girl report matched. Frustration grew with every day that passed without answers, and the case began to gain national attention. Police started considering the possibility that the girl had been brought from another state, left there intentionally in a desolate spot precisely to prevent identification. Theories quickly multiplied. Was it a kidnapping gone wrong? A murder by a family member who then fled the state? A homeless child, one of those traveling with itinerant families in the difficult post-war years. Questions piled up while the body, now officially buried, rested beneath a headstone that simply read, "Little Miss Nobody, blessed are the pure in heart." For years, groups of citizens, local journalists, and amateur forensics enthusiasts tried to keep the memory of the unnamed girl alive. Her body was exhumed several times over the decades, with the hope of applying new scientific techniques that could offer some answers. In the 1970s, more detailed dental analyses were conducted. In the 1990s, comparisons were attempted with old unresolved disappearance cases. And by the 21st century, forensic DNA technology was used, technology that began to open doors that once seemed sealed forever. One of the most hopeful moments came in 2015, when a group of volunteer genealogists, working with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, succeeded in developing a viable genetic profile from bone remains. With that profile, the information was entered into public genealogy databases. The technique, known as investigative genetic genealogy, has revolutionized modern criminology, and in this case, it became the last hope of giving a name to the girl buried for over half a century under an identity born of desperation and the media. In March of 2022, after years of cross-referencing family branches, partial matches, and documentary reconstructions, Yavapai County authorities announced something no one thought possible. Little Miss Nobody had a name. Her name was Sharon Lee Gallegos. She was 4 years old. She had disappeared on July 21, 1960, 10 days before the discovery, in Alamogordo, New Mexico, while playing near her home. She had been abducted in broad daylight by a woman who took her in a car alongside a man. Her family had searched for her desperately for days, but the case had faded into the background, lost in state bureaucracy and the lack of technological resources. The relief of knowing who she was did not erase the most painful questions. Who were her abductors? What happened to her during those 10 days before she was buried in the Arizona desert? Why was she abandoned that way? Was she murdered, or did she die of natural causes while in captivity? The original autopsy was never able to determine the exact cause of death, and with the remains so deteriorated, even today it is difficult to reconstruct Sharon's final moments precisely. But it was clear her body showed no visible gunshot wounds or stabbing injuries. Forensic experts suggested a possible combination of extreme neglect, dehydration, or asphyxiation. A cruel act, regardless of whether it was premeditated or not. For the Gallegos family, receiving the news more than 6 decades later was a devastating mix of comfort and grief. They had lived an entire lifetime without answers, mentally replaying the last moments they saw her, reviewing her face each time a missing girl appeared on television, silently bearing the pain of not having a place to mourn her. And suddenly, the answer arrived. Her body had been there all along, just a few hundred kilometers from home. With the identification confirmed, Sharon's name was added to the grave. The epitaph was modified to reflect her identity, closing at least one part of a circle that had seemed eternal. But the mystery still lingers behind that new marble. The crime remains unsolved. No one has been arrested. The vehicle she was last seen in has never been fully identified. The face of the woman who took her by the hand that July afternoon remains nameless, floating between blurry sketches and aged testimonies. The story of Little Miss Nobody is a brutal reminder of how anonymity can extend beyond death, of how a child can vanish from the world without leaving a trace, without a clear photograph, without a search large enough to span multiple states. And it is also a lesson in persistence, of how science, joined with the memory of those who refuse to forget, can bring even the oldest and most faded cases to light. Sharon Lee Gallegos is no longer a name lost among old papers. She is no longer a generic figure wrapped in a striking headline. She is a real girl with a broken story, a family who mourned her in silence, and a gravestone that now speaks with her true voice. That her story has been recovered does not undo the injustice of her death, but it does restore the humanity of what, for more than 60 years, was nothing more than a dusty police file. The mystery of the Somerton Man. On the morning of December 1st, 1948, on the quiet beach of Somerton, south of Adelaide, Australia, the body of a man was found lying on the sand, with his head resting against a stone wall and his legs extended, crossed naturally. At first glance, he appeared to be asleep. He wore a suit and tie, perfectly polished shoes, a neatly ironed jacket without a single wrinkle, as if he had just come out of an important meeting. He wore no hat, something unusual for the time, but he had a serene expression, free from any sign of anguish or violence. Nothing about him suggested he had died under strange circumstances, and yet, that impeccable figure would soon become one of the most unfathomable mysteries of the 20th century. When the police arrived at the scene, they confirmed that the man was dead. There were no obvious signs of struggle, no visible wounds, and no documents to help identify him. The most puzzling detail was the content of his pockets. Bills in perfect condition, a pack of chewing gum, cigarettes of one brand inside a pack of another. A detail that might seem trivial were it not for the rest of the anomalies. A razor blade, used bus tickets, a comb, and a box of matches. All the objects were common, yet none revealed who the man was. His clothing, meanwhile, showed a peculiarity. All the factory labels had been meticulously cut out, as if someone had tried to erase any trace of origin. The autopsy did not reveal much more. His heart and liver showed signs of congestion. His stomach contained blood, and the organs seemed to have been affected by some toxic substance. However, no trace of poison was found. Experts considered the possibility of an extremely difficult-to-detect drug, but without conclusive chemical proof, the official cause of death was undetermined. It was as if life had vanished from his body suddenly and cleanly, without violence, without scandal, without leaving a trace. The lack of identification led the authorities to broaden the investigation. Days later, an abandoned suitcase at Adelaide's train station was linked to the unknown man. Inside were more clothes with the labels removed, sewing tools, personal hygiene items, and a spool of unusually rare orange thread, the same kind found sewn into the trousers of the body. One of the most striking items was a blade sharpener and a small amount of white powder, although its composition was undetermined. The suitcase also had no tags, no names, nothing. The investigation seemed to stall until, weeks later, an officer re-examining the victim's personal effects discovered something previously overlooked. Hidden in a small pocket of the trousers, folded with surgical precision, was a scrap of paper with 2 words printed in block letters. Tamam shud. The phrase was Persian and means ended or finished. Detectives, intrigued, searched for the origin of the words and soon found it. They belonged to a book of poetry called the Rubaiyat by the author Omar Khayyam, a philosophical and melancholic text about the passage of time and the inevitability of death. That clue opened a new path, a far more enigmatic one. The police launched a public campaign to find the edition of the Rubaiyat from which the scrap had been torn. Surprisingly, a man came forward stating that days before the discovery of the body, he had found a copy of that book lying in the back seat of his car, which had been parked near the beach. Inside the book, besides the space where the scrap was missing, there were some annotations written in pencil, a sequence of apparently meaningless letters, and a phone number. The letters, arranged in lines, resembled a code. It was never deciphered. The phone number, for its part, belonged to a woman who lived just a few blocks from where the body had been found. The woman, identified as Jessica Thompson, was a nurse, a single mother, and, according to reports, completely baffled by the situation. She said she did not know the man, although when shown a facial reconstruction of the corpse, she seemed visibly shaken, yet denied any connection. It was later revealed that years earlier, she had given a copy of the Rubaiyat to a man named Alf Boxall, who had served in military intelligence. For a while it was thought that Boxall might be the Somerton Man, but he was alive and still had his copy of the book, untouched. The mystery returned to square one, only with more shadows. Over the decades, multiple theories emerged. Some pointed to a carefully planned suicide. Others, to a murder involving espionage. The fact that Australia, in the post-war period, was a hotspot for activity among foreign intelligence agencies fit the strange details of the case. The tickets with no final destination, the removed labels, the possible use of an undetectable substance, and the code found in the book. It was even speculated that Jessica Thompson could have been linked to some secret network, or that the man had been eliminated after discovering or attempting to reveal sensitive information. However, no evidence of espionage was ever found. For years, the body remained buried in West Terrace Cemetery, under a tombstone identifying him as the unknown man, and the case was taken up by amateur investigators, writers, cryptographers, and even intelligence experts who tried to uncover his identity. With the arrival of the 21st century, new advances in genetic analysis offered a possible solution to the enigma. In 2021, after decades of attempts and appeals, the Australian authorities approved the exhumation of the body to perform full DNA sequencing. The technique used, known as forensic genetic genealogy, had already solved dozens of cold cases in other countries. The results took more than a year, but in July 2022, the South Australia Police announced that they had finally identified the Somerton Man. He was Carl Charles Webb, an electrical engineer born in Melbourne in 1905, who disappeared without a trace in the late 1940s. Webb had no known criminal record, nor any documented links to espionage networks. His life, on the surface, had been ordinary, but many details still did not add up. Why did he travel to Adelaide? Why was he so far from home without informing anyone, without documents, and with a Persian poem sewn into his clothes like a kind of personal epilogue? Was he a victim of someone? Did he take his own life for unknown reasons? Or was there still an essential piece missing that had not yet been discovered? Webb's identification closed a fundamental part of the case, but opened a new dimension of questions. Because the truth is that putting a name to a corpse does not always mean understanding its story. The identity of the Somerton Man remains, in essence, an incomplete map. One where we now know where he began, but still do not understand where he intended to go. And perhaps that is what makes it so disturbing. That even now, with the most precise scientific advances, with decades of study, hypotheses, and speculation, the man lying on the beach, impeccable even in death, continues to speak to us with a silence that no one has fully managed to translate. The Jamison Family. On October 8, 2009, in the hills of Red Oak, a mountainous and semi-wooded region in southeastern Oklahoma, a landscape known for its isolation and little-used dirt roads, something occurred that would baffle authorities for years. Bobby Jamison, his wife Sherilyn, and their 6-year-old daughter Madison left their home in Eufaula with the intention, they said, of exploring a rural plot of land for sale where they planned to place a prefabricated house. It was a decision driven by a deep desire to start over, to disconnect from their previous environment, and to live a kind of voluntary retreat far from noise, debt, and everyday conflict. However, what was supposed to be a short family trip turned into a disturbing enigma because the Jamisons never returned. And what was left behind was a sequence of clues that seemed carefully designed to lead nowhere. Days after their disappearance, a hunter found the family's truck abandoned on the edge of a dusty trail in the middle of the woods. The doors were closed but not locked. Inside, officers found a completely surreal scene. Mobile phones, wallets with documents and IDs, a camera, a compass, the family dog still alive but extremely dehydrated, and a cash amount exceeding $30,000 hidden in a bag under the seat. The truck showed no signs of violence, no blood, no broken glass, no evidence of a struggle. It was as if the family had parked willingly, stepped out of the vehicle, and walked into the forest as calmly as someone going to buy something at a store. And after that, nothing more. For months, exhaustive searches were carried out by air and land. Trained dogs, helicopters, and volunteers were deployed. But the steep terrain full of slopes and thick vegetation that seemed to close in on the paths made each attempt difficult. There was no trace of Bobby, Sherilyn, or Madison. No campsite, no improvised shelter, no trace of campfires. Not even nearby security cameras captured anything that could help reconstruct their last movements. It seemed the forest had swallowed them whole, with an effectiveness that defied the usual logic of disappearance cases. Authorities began to look back, searching for patterns, previous signs that might shed some light. And what they found was even more puzzling. Days before the trip, a security camera installed on the Jamison property captured footage of Bobby and Sherilyn moving strangely around their vehicle. For nearly half an hour, they entered and exited the truck in silence, methodically loading objects, almost robotically, without speaking, without looking at each other, with a stiffness that some interpreted as an altered state of consciousness. The scene looked like it came from a surveillance tape where something invisible was dictating every step. The most unsettling part was that no one could explain this behavior. Was it the effect of medication? Some substance? An extreme emotional state? Speaking to relatives and acquaintances, investigators discovered that Bobby and Sherilyn were not in a good place. Both were unemployed and suffered from episodes of depression and severe stress. Bobby had been diagnosed with debilitating chronic pain after a work accident and spent most of his time at home, isolated. Sherilyn was described as a spiritual person, prone to emotional extremes, and with a complicated relationship with those around her. They had expressed a desire to disconnect from the system, to live in a remote area with only the bare essentials. There was even mention of a supposed interest in the occult, in protection rituals, and in angry messages directed at neighbors, found in personal journals inside the house. And yet, none of this explained what had happened. Because even in the middle of an emotional crisis, abandoning a vehicle filled with money, documents, food, and a dog they deeply loved seemed completely contradictory. Some investigators began to speculate that the Jamisons had been victims of a crime. The presence of so much cash suggested a failed deal, a dangerous debt, or a secret transaction gone wrong. Others thought of a collective suicide, a sort of family pact carried out in the silence of the woods, far from any witnesses. But none of these hypotheses held up completely when compared with the details. There were no farewell letters, no history of shared suicidal thoughts, no remains had been found, no clear signs of violence, and no one admitted to having had any real conflict with them. The case stalled for nearly 4 years, until in November 2013, a group of hikers exploring the area out of pure curiosity stumbled upon something protruding from the dry leaves and hardened soil: human remains. Less than 5 kilometers from where the truck had originally been found, in a hollow in the terrain, the skeletons of 3 people were discovered, partially disarticulated, with no recognizable clothing, no personal items, and in such an advanced state of decomposition that the cause of death could not be determined with certainty. Forensic analysis confirmed they were Bobby, Sherilyn, and Madison. From that discovery, the case took an abrupt turn, but not toward clarity. How was it possible for 3 bodies to remain for so long so close to the search zone without being found? Had they died there, or had they been moved later? Did they die at the same time, or separately? Was it a crime, an accident, a prolonged disorientation that ended in tragedy? The answers still did not appear, and each attempt at explanation encountered the same sense of emptiness. The Latimer County coroner declared that no visible injuries were found on the bones, ruling out, at least initially, violent deaths by blunt or firearm trauma. But no traces of poison or signs of animal attacks were found either. The bodies were complete, though disorganized, and in a state that did not help reconstruct the final circumstances. The official report concluded that the cause of death was undetermined. In the absence of solid facts, theories continued to multiply. Some spoke of witchcraft practices, linking symbols found on the Jamison property to spiritualist rituals, though no direct connection to esoteric groups was ever confirmed. Others pointed to the possibility of a multiple homicide, committed by someone close and silent, who knew how to cover their tracks well. There were even those who mentioned paranormal phenomena, abductions, or external interference, ideas that always arise when traditional logic runs out. To this day, the case of the Jamison family remains unsolved. No arrests, no confession, no definitive reconstruction. The forest where they disappeared remains, as serene and indifferent as ever, as if it knows something it refuses to share. The image of the truck, with the doors closed, the dog panting in the back seat, and a sum of money hidden without clear purpose, has become a symbol of everything the case represents. The tension between what appears and what is, between evidence and emptiness, between human lives and the silences that sometimes swallow them without warning. The Long Island Killer, Gilgo Beach. On May 3, 2010, in a windswept coastal area not far from the bustling city of New York, a police officer was walking with his K9 dog on Gilgo Beach, Long Island, during a routine search related to a disappearance. What he found among the bushes on the side of Ocean Parkway was much more than a clue. It was a body, that of a woman wrapped in burlap, carefully placed, as if it had been deliberately positioned there with a precise intention. What seemed like an isolated discovery became, in the following weeks, the entrance to an abyss of horrors carefully hidden among the sand and brush. As the searches progressed, more bodies began to appear. 4 in total, within a stretch of barely 500 meters. All women. All sex workers. All had disappeared under similar circumstances. The killer had been there, for years, without being seen. What the authorities discovered in Gilgo Beach was more than a series of murders. It was confirmation that, for at least a decade, someone had been hunting vulnerable women on the outskirts of one of the most heavily surveilled metropolises on the planet, and had done so with such precision, control, and patience that no one noticed until it was already too late. In total, the number of bodies connected to the case eventually rose to at least 11, though some investigators believe there could be more. The victims were found in different states of decomposition, some only as torsos, others completely skeletonized, many not able to be identified until years later. What they all shared was the pattern. Young women, contacted through adult service websites, who disappeared after meetings with supposed clients, and whose remains appeared along a coastal strip where the sea and undergrowth seemed to conspire to preserve the secret. The case officially began with the disappearance of Shannon Gilbert, a 24-year-old escort who had last been seen running, barefoot and in a state of panic, through a gated community known as Oak Beach. Her call to 911 was distressing. For more than 20 minutes, Shannon begged for help, claiming someone was chasing her. The recording, which would not be made public until years later, revealed a woman genuinely terrified, who knocked on several doors pleading for help without anyone responding with the necessary urgency. Her body, however, was not found with the others. It took a year and a half to locate it, in a marshy area not far from where she had disappeared. It was partially submerged and covered by dense vegetation. The police initially claimed it had been an accident, that Shannon, under the influence of medication, had panicked, run into the swamp, and died of natural causes. But neither her family nor many independent investigators ever accepted that version. The discovery of other bodies during the search for Shannon was what changed everything, because although the authorities were quick to separate her case from the rest, to many it was clear that her disappearance had unleashed Pandora's box. The other victims, gradually identified, were Amberlynn Costello, Maureen Brainerd Barnes, Melissa Barthélemy, and Megan Waterman, among others. All had worked in or around New York. All had been contacted via the internet. All disappeared after heading to an appointment, and all were found wrapped in burlap, with remains suggesting strangulation and post-mortem manipulation. For years, the case of the Long Island serial killer, or LISK, as dubbed by the media, became a symbol of institutional failure in the face of crimes committed against marginalized individuals. Many denounced that, had the victims been women with traditional professions or from wealthy backgrounds, the response would have been different. The initial lack of resources, fragmentation among police agencies, and poor cooperation between jurisdictions turned the case into a bureaucratic nightmare. There were even suspicions of internal corruption, especially after the removal of Suffolk County Police Chief James Burke, who was accused of covering up errors and protecting certain interests. That institutional mistrust fueled the theory that the killer might be someone powerful, with access to police information, or even someone within the system itself. Theories abounded. Some believed the killer was a trucker who knew the area well. Others thought of a doctor, due to the meticulous way the bodies were handled. There was talk of a former soldier, a politician, even of an organized group involved in human trafficking. But no concrete lead allowed for a direct indictment. Until, in July 2023, after more than a decade of uncertainty, New York State Police announced the arrest of a man who had lived for years just a few kilometers from Gilgo Beach, Rex Heuermann, a middle-aged architect with an apparently ordinary life and no criminal record. He was linked through DNA analysis, phone records, and digital data, connecting him to at least 3 of the victims. The impact was immediate. Not only because of the profile of the detainee, someone who had worked in Manhattan, married with children, and no public signs of violence, but because of how long he had gone unnoticed. In his home, investigators found a series of safes, electronic devices, and documents that are still being analyzed today, in hopes of understanding whether he acted alone, committed more crimes, or was aided in covering up his actions. Despite the arrest, the case is far from closed. There are still unidentified victims, and Shannon Gilbert's death continues to be officially treated as accidental, despite the multiple signs suggesting otherwise. What makes this case so disturbing is not only the number of deaths or the brutality with which they were committed. It is the structured coldness with which the killer acted for years in one of the most monitored states in the country, without anyone noticing. It is the institutional indifference that allowed the bodies to remain hidden for so long, in the same corridor, without a thorough search being launched from the beginning. It is the fact that the victims were women who, because they worked in a stigmatized profession, did not receive the same protection as others. And it is, above all, the feeling that even with the suspect behind bars, the story has not yet revealed all it has to tell. Because in Gilgo Beach, the sand still keeps secrets. Secrets that may never come to light. Secrets that perhaps someone is still hiding. And as long as there are nameless bodies and families without answers, the echo of those silent nights, when someone acted with terrible calm under the cover of darkness, will continue to resonate in every chronicle, in every headline, and in the collective memory of those who look toward the coast not with admiration, but with a distrust that will never fully fade. The case of the Yuba City Men. On February 24, 1978, 5 friends left their home in Yuba City, California, with the usual excitement that accompanies a game night. They were all fans of college basketball, and that Friday night they drove a turquoise 1969 Mercury Montego to Chico, a nearby town where a game was being held that they did not want to miss. There was no indication that anything extraordinary would occur. They had attended this type of event many times before. They were used to moving as a group, looking out for one another, and always returning home without trouble. But that night, something took them off course. Something led them away from the main road and into a mountainous, inhospitable area covered in late winter snow. And And it was there, among twisted trees, icy paths, and complete darkness, that the mystery began to take shape. The young men, Bill Sterling, Jack Madruga, Ted Weiher, Jackie Hewitt, and Gary Mathias, were between 24 and 32 years old, and all had some form of mild or moderate mental disability, except for Mathias, who suffered from paranoid schizophrenia controlled with medication. They were known in their community as the Yuba Boys, and their families described their bond as inseparable. They protected one another with tenderness, shared routines, attended rehabilitation centers together, and above all, deeply valued each other's company. On the night of the game, their families knew exactly where they were going and when they planned to return. But by morning, when they did not appear, worry took hold of everyone. It was unusual, even unthinkable, for them not to call or to fail to return without warning. Police began the search that very day, without much to go on. There were no calls, no witnesses who had seen them after the game, and their families confirmed that they had no reason to stray from the Chico area. However, days later, the Mercury Montego was found abandoned on a rural road in the Sierra Nevada, over 100 kilometers in the opposite direction. It was in perfect condition. It had enough fuel, showed no signs of mechanical failure, and the keys were not inside. The car appeared to have been carefully parked, as if they had intended to return at any moment. Snow partially covered the tires, but it was not stuck. They had simply left it there and vanished. The area where the car was found was rugged, wooded, and at that time of year, dangerously cold at night. The nearby roads led nowhere relevant to them. It was a remote region, with no shelters, no gas stations, and certainly no basketball courts. No one could understand why 5 men with no hiking experience, with cognitive and emotional difficulties, would abandon a functional vehicle in such conditions to walk into such a hostile environment. It was as if something had forced them, or as if they were fleeing from something that pushed them off their natural course. The search intensified. For weeks, rescue teams combed the area with no results. The snow covered everything, and the silence of the forest revealed no clues. Until 4 months later, in June, when the thaw allowed exploration of previously inaccessible areas, the first body was discovered. It was Ted Weiher, found inside a trailer belonging to the Forest Service, nearly 30 kilometers from where the car had been found. The trailer was not locked. Inside there were blankets, gas heating, canned food, warm clothing, even enough supplies to survive for weeks. But what they found was chilling. Ted was dead, lying on an improvised bed, wrapped in several blankets, and his body showed signs that he had survived for as long as 13 weeks after the disappearance. The strangest part was that, despite having access to food and heat, Ted had lost nearly 20 kilograms, and his feet showed signs of severe frostbite. There was no sign that the heater had been turned on, or that the stored food had been used. It was as if, for some reason, he had allowed himself to die slowly, just steps away from salvation. Additionally, his shoes were missing. No one could explain why he would have taken them off, and worse still, why he had not used the available resources in the trailer. His beard growth suggested he survived a long time, possibly in complete isolation. But why had he not sought help? Where were the others? Shortly afterward, bone remains were found near the trailer. They belonged to Bill Sterling and Jackie Hewitt. The bones were scattered across the terrain, indicating that they probably died from exposure to the cold, disoriented, never having reached the shelter where Ted died. Hewitt was only 16 years old and, it appears, was the first to die. Forensic analysis determined that the 3 died from natural causes related to hypothermia and starvation, although the conditions were so extreme that the deterioration of the bodies made any absolute certainty difficult. Jack Madruga was found near a secondary road, several kilometers from the trailer, his body partially buried in snow. His death was also attributed to exposure. What was curious was the way the 5 men had taken different paths instead of staying together. Walking in a straight line along the road, they could have reached an inhabited area, but they chose the most remote and dangerous direction. The only body never found was that of Gary Mathias. His shoes were found inside the trailer, which raised even more questions. It was as if, at some point, Gary had been there, with Ted, and then left for some reason. Had he gone to seek help? Had he tried to return to the car? Or did he get lost in the forest and die in a place where no one has searched again? His medical history included episodes of disorientation, but in the years prior to his disappearance, he had remained stable with medication. And being physically the fittest of the group, many believe he was the one who led the walk to the trailer. Over time, the case of the Yuba City men became a legend among investigators of unsolved mysteries. There were no signs of violence, no traces of others, no indications of a crime. Yet everything felt strangely unnatural. From the decision to leave the car to the disturbing death of Ted inside a perfectly stocked shelter to the complete disappearance of Gary, every element seemed to defy common sense. Some have suggested theories about an unreported chase, an encounter with hostile people in the mountains, or even a collective episode of paranoia or mental confusion. Others suggest that something happened within the group that caused them to distrust one another, or triggered a chain of absurd decisions with fatal consequences. And yet, all of this remains speculation. There are no definitive answers, only a fragmented timeline, scattered bodies, an abandoned vehicle, and a winter that erased with its white mantle the traces of a night that should never have ended the way it did. The case remains open, more as a warning than as an active investigation. A natural and human puzzle where the pieces exist, but fit together with a logic that escapes us. And as long as the body of Gary Mathias does not appear and the final truth is not revealed, the frozen forests of Plumas National Forest will continue to guard the story of those 5 friends who went out to watch a basketball game and unknowingly entered one of the strangest mysteries of the 20th century in the United States. The murder of Jill Dando. On April 26, 1999, shortly before noon, on a quiet street in the elegant London neighborhood of Fulham, BBC journalist and presenter Jill Dando was cold-bloodedly murdered right outside her front door. A single shot, clean and precise, to the side of her head. A crime without direct witnesses, without security cameras, without obvious signs of struggle, and executed so quickly that not even the neighbors reacted in time. Jill, 37 years old, a well-known and beloved public figure across the United Kingdom, fell to the ground without even having a chance to turn or raise her hands. She died instantly. Since then, her death has become an open wound in British memory, not only because of the brutality of the act, but also because of the shadow of uncertainty that surrounds it to this day. Jill Dando was more than just a famous face on television. She was the host of Crime Watch, a program dedicated to reconstructing real crimes to aid in their resolution. She had also worked as a correspondent and primetime news anchor, and her empathetic and elegant style had made her an iconic figure in British journalism of the 90s. For many, she embodied trustworthy information, a reliable voice amidst chaos. Her murder, therefore, was doubly baffling, for its unexpectedness and its symbolism. It was as if the crime had chosen the most unlikely victim to prove that not even familiar faces are safe. The crime scene did not help clarify what happened. The door to her house remained closed, indicating that Jill had not managed to enter. It is believed that someone waited for her, approached her from behind or the side, and shot her with a firearm in broad daylight. The most unsettling aspect was the manner of execution. According to forensic experts, it was a close-range shot, with the gun pressed against her temple, suggesting technical knowledge, almost professional. With no signs of robbery or additional violence, The act bore the hallmarks of a deliberate, precise, planned execution. Yet there was not a single solid lead. Nobody saw a face. Nobody heard an argument. Nobody recognized a suspicious vehicle in the area. The killer had entered and vanished in seconds, like a shadow. The police deployed one of the largest operations in the recent history of the metropolis. Hundreds of nearby security recordings were reviewed, dozens of acquaintances interviewed. The victim's day was reconstructed minute by minute, and over 2,000 tips from the public were received. Among the first theories was that of an obsessive admirer. Jill, due to her fame, had received fan mail and some disturbing messages over the years, though none indicated a concrete threat. The possibility of a robbery gone wrong was also considered, but the conditions of the murder, no fingerprints, no signs of a struggle, no items taken, contradicted that hypothesis. The case grew even murkier when theories related to her work on Crime Watch emerged. Some media suggested that her role as a crime presenter had exposed her to resentful criminals or even organizations wanting to send a message. A disturbing but plausible idea, considering the program had contributed to multiple arrests in previous years. Others claimed she had been involved in a campaign to expose child abuse networks, which would have provoked powerful enemies. Although no direct evidence supported this theory, it resonated deeply in public opinion, fueling the imagination of a crime with larger implications. Pressure to find the culprit led police to focus on a man named Barry George, a local resident with a history of erratic behavior, who had been seen loitering in the area days before the murder. George was an individual with mental health issues and a record of minor offenses, but no apparent connection to Jill Dando. Despite the weakness of the case, he was arrested, tried, and convicted in 2001. The main evidence against him was a microscopic particle of bullet residue found on a jacket in his home. The media hailed the verdict as closure for the national trauma. However, it was not the end. In 2007, after an appeal and new forensic analyses, it was concluded that the powder residue could have reached the jacket through cross-contamination. The key evidence crumbled, and with it, the entire accusation. Barry George was exonerated and released. The police were back to square one. The entire country faced again the original void, with a sense of injustice made worse by having believed for 6 years that the case was solved. Since then, the investigation has remained open, although without substantial progress. Theories, however, have continued to multiply. Some point to an international connection. Others have linked her death to Jill's participation in humanitarian projects, such as her support for Kosovo refugees or her collaboration with charitable organizations active in conflict zones. It has been suggested, without conclusive proof, that she might have been on the radar of radical groups. It has also been hinted that her death was a case of mistaken identity, that the killer confused Jill with someone else. This last idea, although less spectacular, has been seriously considered by some experts due to the lack of a direct motive. What remains, in the end, is an unfinished chronicle, a story that raises more questions than answers, and that still beats in the collective consciousness of the United Kingdom as one of its greatest unresolved tragedies. The image of Jill Dando, smiling, serene, professional, remains alive in the memory of those who saw her daily on television, and her death continues to evoke a deep feeling of loss and bewilderment. Every anniversary, every documentary, every attempt to reopen the case revives not only the mystery, but also the need to find meaning in what seems completely resistant to logic. And perhaps that is the most unsettling thing, that in a city with millions of eyes, with sophisticated surveillance systems and overwhelming media pressure, someone was able to carry out a crime of such nature with such precision and vanish without leaving a trace. As if Jill Dando's death were an act outside of time, an anomaly in the fabric of everyday reality, a hole through which something still not understood has slipped through. The case of Tamla Horsford. On November 4th, 2018, in Forsyth County, Georgia, an upper-middle-class residential community awoke wrapped in the usual silence of American suburbs. Spacious houses, well-kept gardens, new cars in the garages, and mild weather anticipating the arrival of winter. At first glance, it was the kind of place where nothing important ever seems to happen. However, that morning, while the city slept, the lifeless body of a woman was found face down in the backyard of one of those homes. Her name was Tamla Horsford. She was 40 years old, a mother of 5 children, of Afro-Caribbean origin, and she had attended the previous night a women-only party organized to celebrate a friend's birthday. What was supposed to be a night of games, drinks, and laughter ended in a tragedy whose circumstances, far from becoming clearer over time, became more clouded until it turned into a case surrounded by suspicion, contradictions, and public outrage. Tamla had arrived at the party on the night of November 3rd. She was invited by an acquaintance, Jean Myers, and went enthusiastically. She wore themed pajamas like the other women, brought a bottle of liquor, and had a friendly and outgoing attitude. The attendees were all white women, mostly mothers, wives, and professionals, many of whom knew each other. There were 10 women in total, along with 2 men present, the host's boyfriend and another guest who arrived later. Throughout the night, the women shared drinks, played cards, took photos, and uploaded some stories to social media. Tamla, in the available images and videos, appears smiling, dancing, interacting naturally. Nothing seemed to anticipate a fatal outcome. According to the accounts of those present, the night passed without incident. Gradually, some of the guests began to leave. Tamla, who had drunk some tequila and smoked a little marijuana, according to later toxicology results, decided to stay overnight at the house. It was not unusual. She had enough trust to do so and had an assigned space. At some point between 1:30 and 2 o'clock a.m., some saw her for the last time, still awake. The rest went to sleep. The next morning, at 7:30, the host's boyfriend found her body in the backyard, in a position that immediately caused confusion. She was face down, with her arms stretched out to the sides, legs straight, and still wearing her pajamas. It looked as if she had fallen from the second-floor railing overlooking the yard, as if she had gone out to smoke and lost her balance. That was, in fact, the initial explanation. An accident. But the scene had too many disturbing details. Tamla's body showed multiple injuries, lacerations on the face, bruises on the wrists, cuts on the legs, a dislocated left wrist, and a traumatic head injury. The autopsy determined the official cause of death was multiple injuries from a fall, consistent with an accident from the mentioned height. However, photographic reports leaked later, as well as an independent analysis requested by the family, suggested something else. The position of the body, blood patterns, and severity of injuries were not consistent with a simple accidental fall. Additionally, inconsistencies were detected in the testimonies, inaccuracies about the time Tamla was last seen, and a general lack of coherence among statements, as if each person remembered something different. The case was initially treated as an accidental death by the Forsyth County Sheriff's Office, a jurisdiction with a delicate history regarding racial tensions. Forsyth, for much of the 20th century, was a county populated exclusively by white residents, known for violently expelling its African American community early in the last century. Although the present no longer reflects that reality so starkly, the weight of the past is not easily erased, and Tamla's presence, a black woman, charismatic, surrounded by a group of white women, began to take on a different dimension when the official responses were so quick and decisive. Accident. Case closed. But Tamla's family did not accept that conclusion. Her husband and children, devastated by the loss, hired a second autopsy, conducted by an independent forensic pathologist. The new report revealed injuries that, according to its author, could suggest a prior confrontation. Among them, blows to the back of the head that would not be compatible with a forward fall. The time Tamla may have been exposed to the weather without being discovered was also questioned, as well as the supposed absence of noise during the night. In a house with more than 10 people sleeping, no one heard a loud bang, a scream, or a jolt. Nobody heard anything. When the case was reopened in 2020, under pressure from social movements and national media exposure, there was an attempt to review the file with fresh eyes. But many key pieces of evidence were already contaminated or missing. The 911 report, made by one of the men present, seemed strangely detached. The tone of voice, the way he described the body as lying like a doll, the lack of emotional urgency, all contributed to a feeling of coldness. Complete toxicology tests were not performed on the others present, nor were mobile phones immediately isolated to record messages, calls, or possible deletion of content. Over the months, Tamla Horsford's case became a symbol. Her face, printed on posters and shared by millions of users on social media, was adopted as a banner by those denouncing the unequal treatment of deaths of Black people in legally ambiguous contexts. The fact that she was the only Black woman at a party where all the others were white, and that her death was considered an accident without a deep analysis of the contradictions, sparked a wave of outrage that crossed states and borders. Her name began to be mentioned alongside other emblematic cases of racial injustice in the United States, and calls for a federal investigation multiplied. To this day, the Georgia Medical Examiner's Office maintains the official cause of death as an accident. The FBI reviewed the case and concluded that there was not enough evidence to file criminal charges. However, for many that does not close the story, because beyond the technical explanations, there is an emotional truth, a void that reports cannot fill. The feeling that something more happened that night, something that has not been said or was silenced out of fear, convenience, or complicity. The death of Tamla Horsford, with her smile immortalized in family photos, with her visible energy in the last video she recorded that night, remains an open wound. Not for lack of data, but for lack of truth. Because when a body falls, and no one seems to hear it, and everyone says the same thing but not with the same voice, one cannot help but wonder if silence is part of the crime. The Delphi Double Murder, Indiana, 2017. On February 13, 2017, in the small town of Delphi, Indiana, the winter sun gently shone over the Monon High Bridge Trail, an old railway line converted into a scenic trail that winds through bare trees and silent fields. It was a Monday with no school, which allowed two friends, 13 and 14 years old, Abigail Williams and Liberty German, to take advantage of the afternoon doing something they loved. Walking in nature, taking photos, talking about everything and nothing, and breathing fresh air away from the hustle of middle school. They were inseparable, one of those friendships forged in adolescence with absolute loyalty. And that day they had convinced Libby's sister to drive them to the park, agreeing she would pick them up a few hours later. They never returned alive. What happened in that forest changed forever not only Delphi, a town of barely 3,000 inhabitants, but also the perception of safety in rural areas of the United States. Because until that day, nothing in Delphi seemed dangerous. It was a place where people left their doors open, where neighbors knew each other by first and last name, where afternoon walks required no supervision. And yet, in such an open, visited, and familiar space, someone stalked two girls, chased them, cornered them, and killed them with such cold blood and meticulous planning that, to this day, their identity remains wrapped in a veil of horror and confusion. The teenagers were reported missing late in the afternoon when they did not arrive at the agreed meeting point. Authorities acted quickly. An immediate search was organized. Volunteers, drones, canine patrols, and helicopters were activated. But it was the next day, less than a kilometer from where they were last seen, where teams found their bodies in a wooded area near Deer Creek. The exact details of how they were murdered were never fully made public, partly to protect the integrity of the investigation, but what is known is enough to understand that it was a chilling scene. Both showed signs of extreme violence, and their bodies had been arranged in a way that suggested a kind of message or ritual beyond a simple homicidal impulse. The most disturbing part of the case was that the victims, aware that something was wrong, managed to capture the killer on a mobile phone. Liberty German, showing a cold blood that is impossible not to admire, activated her phone's camera as the attacker approached them. The recorded video shows a man walking along the train tracks, wearing a cap, a blue jacket, hands in his pockets, and walking deliberately. Although his face is not fully visible, the image is clear enough to create a description. Even more chilling is the audio extracted from the same file. The killer, with a firm and unwavering voice, says, "Down the hill," giving the order that probably marked the beginning of the last minutes of their lives. That video and audio became the cornerstone of an investigation that mobilized thousands of people across the country. The case was covered by all media, analyzed by forensic experts, criminologists, psychologists, and enthusiasts of unsolved mysteries. For months, and then years, authorities received more than 40,000 tips, compared tens of thousands of faces, collected DNA samples, and released composite sketches. 2 different sketches of the suspect were published, with features that seemed contradictory. One showed an older man, stocky, with a tough face and several days of beard growth. The other, revealed 2 years later, portrayed a much younger man with brown hair and a sharper face. Both were based on indirect witnesses, and the release of the second sketch confused everyone, as if the investigation had taken an unexpected turn and gone back to square one. The Indiana State Police, together with the FBI, continued working quietly, without revealing much about what they knew. They claimed to have a solid idea about how the crime was committed, that the killer was probably someone from the area, familiar with the terrain, and who had returned to his daily life with such skill that no one had detected him. The fact that the crime happened in broad daylight, on a public trail, and that the perpetrator left without being seen, strengthened the idea that this was not his first violent act, nor the first premeditated one. For years, the case seemed to stall. The families of Abby and Libby, especially Liberty German's family, kept the investigation alive in the public sphere. Her sister and grandfather became spokespeople for the case, participating in programs, awareness campaigns, and pushing for progress that did not come. The Delphi community, which at first united in mourning, began to divide because of tension and suspicion. Some thought the killer must be among them, someone who greeted them at the supermarket, worked at a local store, attended religious services as if nothing had happened. That possibility, more than any other, planted a prolonged, silent, and corrosive fear. Then, in October 2022, 5 years after the crime, authorities announced the arrest of a man named Richard Allen, 50 years old, an employee at a pharmacy in Delphi, a family man with no criminal record, and a resident of the town for decades. A name that had never been on the public radar. His arrest was a reality check. The suspect had lived among them all along, had even volunteered for school tasks, and offered help in the search for the girls when they disappeared. The kind of revelation that transforms fear into betrayal. Prosecutors revealed that Allen had confessed to certain details during interrogations, but without making a full admission. Weapons were also found in his home, including a pistol that, according to ballistic tests, matched the mark left on a shell casing found near the girls' bodies. However, the judicial process has been complicated. Allen's defense claims that their client is being used as a scapegoat, that the evidence is circumstantial, and that public pressure has interfered with the objectivity of the case. Amid all this, leaked documents and theories about hidden motives, from rituals to collective acts, have begun to circulate, although none of these have been proven. What is clear is that beyond the material evidence, the pain has not diminished. Delphi still awaits a complete answer, something that explains not only who did it, but why. Because there are crimes whose brutality wounds, but there are others whose logical impossibility hurts even more. The image of Libby holding her phone firmly as the killer approached is one of the most heroic and sad in modern crime history. Her decision allowed an indelible testimony, even if it did not save her life. The Delphi double murder is a warning to all. That even in the quietest corners of the world, where everything seems safe, where routine offers a mirage of protection, there are monsters who know how to walk with slow steps, disguised as neighbors, and that evil, when it acts silently and patiently, can hide for years before someone dares to look it in the eye. The mystery of Tara Calico. The morning of September 20th, 1988, began like so many others in the life of Tara Lee Calico, a 19-year-old young woman who lived with her parents in the small town of Belen in Valencia County, New Mexico. She was organized, determined, an exemplary student, and an amateur athlete with plans to study psychology. That morning, after reviewing her schedule and preparing her portable music player, she asked her mother to pick her up later if she had not returned by a certain time. She told her, almost as a joke, that if she did not come back on time, she probably had her bicycle stolen. That bicycle, a borrowed pink Huffy, would be the last thing known for certain about Tara. As part of her daily routine, Tara went out to follow her usual bike route along Highway 47, a straight and open road that crossed the arid landscape of New Mexico without offering many places to hide. She often listened to cassettes while pedaling, isolating herself from the surrounding noise. Her mother, used to this routine, was not worried at first, but as the afternoon passed with no news of Tara, and the clock far exceeded the expected return time, concern turned into alarm. The family began searching on their own, alerted the authorities, and an investigation was quickly launched in the area. Clues appeared soon after. A few kilometers from the route, they found fragments of Tara's music player, cassettes scattered on the dust, and further ahead, the shattered Walkman. It was as if the objects had been deliberately dropped, like signals, as if Tara had tried to mark her path in the middle of an emergency. However, neither the bicycle nor any piece of clothing was found, nor were there any visible signs of a struggle. The police interviewed several drivers and witnesses who claimed to have seen Tara that morning. Most agreed that a white pickup truck followed her closely at low speed, circling around. Some said she seemed annoyed, as if trying to ignore the persistent presence of the vehicle. But there was no clear identification of the license plate or the driver. And after that day, it was as if Tara had vanished off the map without leaving a trace. The disappearance, due to its strangeness, soon attracted the attention of local media and later nationwide. A healthy, responsible young woman in broad daylight on a visible highway had disappeared with no one able to explain how. Tara's mother, Patty Doyle, became since then the tireless voice of the search. She did not limit herself to standard protocols. She organized campaigns, traveled the country distributing flyers, appeared on television, pressured the authorities, and held an unwavering faith for decades that her daughter was alive. But the case seemed to stall. For months, no new leads appeared, and the investigation lost momentum. Until a year later, in June of 1989, more than 2,000 kilometers away, in a parking lot in Florida, something happened that would change everything. A woman leaving a supermarket in the city of Port St. Joe found a Polaroid photograph lying on the parking lot ground. The image showed two people, a young woman and a boy, both gagged with tape and with their hands tied. They were lying on what appeared to be an improvised bed in the back of a truck or trailer, with a white curtain or tarp as the background. The young woman's face, with brown hair and a restrained expression, immediately raised suspicions. The woman who found the photo handed it over to the authorities, and days later, the images reached the Calico family. Patty Doyle, upon seeing it, broke down. She was convinced it was Tara. Investigators compared the photograph with Tara's dental records and physical features, but the results were inconclusive. While the FBI stated it could neither confirm nor deny that it was her, independent experts hired by the family pointed out obvious similarities, including a specific scar on the leg. As for the boy in the image, the hypothesis arose that he could be Michael Henley, a boy who had disappeared in New Mexico that same year. However, in 1990, his remains were found a few kilometers from where he had disappeared, confirming that his case was unrelated to Tara's. The mystery of the Polaroid then became even more obscure. Was it a hoax? A warning? A real sign of kidnapping for unknown purposes? Beyond that image, other photographs with similar characteristics appeared in the following years, but none could be verified as authentic or directly linked to the case. Some showed gagged women, others were simply blurry and unverifiable. The theory of kidnapping for human trafficking began to gain strength, although without concrete evidence. Tara was young, attractive, charismatic, and her disappearance without visible violence fueled the idea of a carefully executed abduction. The open roads and scattered communities of the southwestern United States provided suitable settings for organized crimes that took advantage of the silence and vulnerability of rural areas. Over time, unofficial statements and rumors pointed to local residents, people who might have known Tara and could have had conflicts with her. An unofficial version, based on testimonies gathered by private investigators and journalists, claimed that two young men, sons of influential figures in the county, had an altercation with Tara that same day, and that the disappearance had been covered up by members of the community. The version spoke of an accident during a confrontation and a subsequent cover-up out of fear of scandal. Although no charges were ever filed and the police did not officially support this theory, the persistence of that rumor reflected the collective confusion over the lack of formal progress. In recent years, thanks to advances in forensic technology, DNA samples have been re-examined and attempts made to connect the case with other databases through genetic genealogy, as has been done in other unsolved crimes. So far, these efforts have not yielded decisive results, but keep alive the possibility of resolution. In 2021, the Valencia County Sheriff declared that there was new information that could be decisive, but since then, no concrete progress has been made public. The community continues to wait. Tara Calico, with her youthful face frozen in family photographs, with her smile of a diligent student, with her cassettes scattered across the asphalt of a lonely highway, represents a deeply unsettling kind of mystery. One that does not depend on the complexity of a crime but on the absurd simplicity of an impossible disappearance. A young woman pedaling along an open route, in broad daylight, with no reason to vanish, and yet she disappears, as if the earth itself had swallowed her. The case remains open. The reward for information remains valid. Her mother, Patty, passed away in 2006 without having obtained answers, but the echo of her voice continues to resonate in every corner where people speak of Tara, her disappearance, and the need to never stop searching. The Zodiac Killer. Among the most disturbing criminal mysteries of the 20th century, there are names that evoke fear at the mere mention, but none with the hypnotic and unsettling power of the one who chose to call himself the Zodiac Killer. A name not given by the press or the police, but by himself, in the letters he sent to newspapers, signed with a symbol, a circle with a cross in the center. Between 1968 and 1969, this killer terrorized Northern California with a series of seemingly random crimes, attacks that appeared out of nowhere and disappeared just as quickly, leaving lifeless bodies, shocked witnesses, and a total sense of helplessness among the authorities. But what made this case transcend the limits of common crime was something far more sinister. The killer's need to be recognized, his desire to manipulate public opinion, and the way he turned his acts into a kind of macabre spectacle with encrypted codes, threats, and a theatricality no other criminal had displayed before. The first confirmed attack occurred on December 20th, 1968, on a little-traveled road near Vallejo. Two teenagers, David Faraday and Betty Lou Jensen, were parked in their car, probably enjoying an intimate moment away from the bustle. That was when someone approached them, armed, and shot them at point-blank range. Betty Lou died instantly. David, still alive, died shortly after, The crime scene made it clear it was not a robbery or a settling of scores. Everything seemed cold, calculated, with no signs of personal motivation. Yet the case went relatively unnoticed, as if the horror had not been striking enough. That changed 6 months later. On July 4th, 1969, another young woman, Darlene Ferrin, was killed in similar circumstances, also in a car, also with her partner beside her, in the same area. This time, there was a survivor, Michael Majot, who, badly injured, managed to give a partial description of the attacker. A white man, stocky, wearing glasses and with short hair. But it was what came next that turned this killer into a legendary figure. Just a few days later, 3 letters arrived at the main newspapers in the Bay Area: the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. All were handwritten, with clumsy and obsessive handwriting, and contained details only the killer could know. In them, he demanded that cryptograms, 4 pages full of symbols and codes, be published, and promised that if they were not, he would kill again. The most disturbing aspect was the mixture of arrogance, mockery, and control that emanated from those texts. The killer was not only proud of his acts, he wanted attention, he wanted notoriety, he wanted to be part of the public conversation. He was a criminal who did not act on impulse, but rather built an identity, and thus began a nightmare shared by the police, the press, and the public, who would receive, over the following years, more than a dozen letters signed with that sinister symbol. Some contained cryptic clues, others new threats, and many included details of crimes not officially connected. As the murders continued, in parks, on roads, even in broad daylight, the figure of the Zodiac Killer solidified as an invisible but ever-present enemy. One of the most chilling attacks occurred on September 27, 1969, at Lake Berryessa. A couple, Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, were enjoying a picnic by the water when they were approached by a man wearing a ski mask, dressed in a strange black outfit with the zodiac symbol drawn on the chest. He tied their hands with pre-prepared ropes and then stabbed them viciously. Cecilia died after hours of agony. Brian survived. The killer left an inscription with a black marker on the couple's car door, with the date of the crime and his signature mark. It was as if he needed to document his work, signing each chapter of a perverse novel only he understood. But the most publicized case was the murder of taxi driver Paul Stein in October 1969. The Zodiac requested a ride in San Francisco, and upon reaching his destination, shot him in the head. It was a different crime, urban, fast, without warning. The most unsettling detail was that after the murder, the killer took Stina's bloody glasses and tore a piece from his shirt. Weeks later, that piece of fabric was sent by mail along with a new letter, confirming his authorship. It was no longer a matter of speculation. The Zodiac was fulfilling his threats. Over the years, dozens of investigators, journalists, analysts, and amateur detectives have tried to decipher his identity. The cryptogram sent in 1969 was partially solved by an amateur couple in less than a week, revealing a message full of grammatical errors where the killer spoke of his collection of slaves for the afterlife. Other messages, however, remained undecipherable for decades, until in 2020, an international team managed to crack the so-called Code 340 using advanced software and linguistic analysis. The message, however, did not reveal his name or a new crime, but one more taunt. It said he was not afraid of the electric chair because he was already prepared for life after death. The list of suspects has been long and controversial. From Arthur Lee Allen, who inspired the famous David Fincher film, to more recent names like Gary Francis Post, pointed out by a group of investigators calling themselves the Case Breakers. However, no evidence has been conclusive. There is no reliable DNA, no irrefutable fingerprints, and every lead seems to lead to a dead end. the Zodiac disappeared from the public scene in the 1970s. Although some investigators believe he could have continued killing under a different modus operandi. Others maintain that he died or simply stopped acting, satisfied with the myth he had created. Beyond the morbid fascination his figure generates, what makes this case particularly unsettling is the way it disrupted the balance between crime and representation. The Zodiac was not just looking to kill. He sought to endure, to be part of culture, to leave a mark beyond the facts. And he succeeded. Half a century later, he remains the subject of documentaries, books, forums, and endless theories. His symbol appears in tattoos, movies, even video games. But what is often lost in that media obsession is the memory of the victims, whose lives were cut short by someone who chose to be an enigma. The case remains officially open. The San Francisco Police Department, along with the FBI and other agencies, maintains extensive files, evidence gathered over years, and ever-dimming hopes of finding a definitive answer. Because the truth is that the Zodiac Killer, with his letters, his games, and his trail of death, achieved what many seek and few accomplish: becoming a symbol. And symbols, unlike bodies, do not easily die. The missing children of Sodder. In the early hours of December 25, 1945, while most homes in Fayetteville, a quiet mining community in West Virginia, celebrated Christmas with gifts, laughter, and twinkling lights, the Sodder family was living through a horror that, over time, would become one of the most enigmatic and heartbreaking child disappearance cases of the 20th century. What began as an unexpected fire turned into a story of unanswered questions, impossible theories, and a desperate struggle to find the truth. A mystery that did not die with the flames but grew among the ruins. George Sodder, of Italian origin, and his wife Jenny lived with 9 of their 10 children in a large 2-story house located on the outskirts of town. They were a hardworking, respected, and discreet family. Christmas Eve of 1945 had passed in a festive mood. The children opened their presents, the parents went to bed early, and some of the older siblings stayed awake longer, enjoying the Christmas atmosphere. It was close to 1 in the morning when the house phone rang unexpectedly. Jenny got up to answer and heard a female voice asking for someone who did not live there. There were laughter and the clinking of glasses in the background. She told her she was mistaken and hung up. Unbeknownst to her, that brief phone call would mark the beginning of the last night she would see 5 of her children. About half an hour later, Jenny was awakened by a sharp noise on the roof, as if something had struck the house hard. A few minutes later, she began to smell smoke. That was when she saw part of the house, right above the office George used for his transportation business, engulfed in flames. She woke her husband and the children who were on the first floor, and they all tried to escape. However, 5 of the children who were sleeping upstairs, Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, aged between 5 and 14, did not come down. The house was consumed by fire in less than an hour. The flames spread so brutally fast that George could not reach the interior staircase. In desperation, he tried to climb up an exterior ladder, which, to his surprise, was not in its usual place. Then he wanted to use his trucks to climb to the 2nd floor, but none of them started, even though they had worked perfectly the day before. As the fire devoured their home, the Sodders called out their children's names, hoping they would come out, but there was no response. When the fire finally died down, the house was a smoking pile of rubble. The worst was expected. Local authorities arrived hours later. The official cause of the fire was attributed to an electrical failure, although some family members insisted that the lights remained on while the house burned, contradicting that theory. The most baffling part came when the remains were searched. No bodies were found, no bone fragments, no identifiable remains of the 5 children, nothing. It was suggested that the fire had been so intense that the bodies had disintegrated, but multiple experts later consulted by the family denied that possibility. Even in longer fires, skeletal remains, especially of children, always leave some trace. Jenny, with fierce determination, conducted home experiments with animal bones in ovens, trying to prove for herself if a household fire could completely erase a body. She never succeeded. From there, the story took an unexpected turn. As days passed, disturbing details began to emerge, small loose pieces that, when put together, suggested something much more sinister had happened that night. A witness said they saw a flaming ball thrown onto the roof of the house, a statement that seemed to confirm the blow Jenny heard shortly before the fire. Another person claimed to have seen some of the children inside a car leaving town while the house burned. At a roadside diner about 40 kilometers away, a waitress said a couple with several children came in for breakfast in the early hours of the 25th, and the children resembled the Sodders. Even a local mailman said he had delivered a package to someone who seemed to hide their face. Everything was vague, ambiguous, without solid proof. But the Sodders could not ignore it. George and Jenny, convinced their children did not die in the fire, began their own investigation. They printed thousands of posters with their children's faces, placed them all over the country, hired private detectives, and even sought help from clairvoyants and mediums. In 1952, they built a huge sign on Route 16 with photographs of the 5 missing children and a reward offer. That sign, maintained for decades, became a symbol of resistance and a question the family never stopped asking. Where are our children? In 1968, more than 2 decades after the fire, Jenny received an unsigned letter sent from Kentucky. Inside was a photograph of a young man about 30 years old, with features similar to those of Louis Sodder, one of the missing children. On the back of the photo, an enigmatic inscription read, "Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, Lil boys, A90132 or 35. It made no sense, but the Sodders were convinced it was their son. They hired an investigator who traveled to Kentucky but disappeared and was never heard from again. The mystery of the Sodder children has been approached from multiple angles. Revenge kidnapping. George was an Italian immigrant with openly anti-fascist opinions, which caused tensions with other compatriots. Child trafficking. Even theories pointing to local complicity. Nothing could be proven. Every lead seemed to vanish upon examination. Authorities, for their part, maintained their original version for decades. The children died in the fire, but they never offered a satisfactory explanation for the total absence of remains. George Sodder died in 1969 without knowing what happened to his children. Jenny lived until 1989, always dressed in black as a sign of permanent mourning, clinging to the hope of a miracle. The surviving children continued the search for years, but over time the case faded in collective memory. Today, although descendants still keep the story alive, the case is formally closed, but emotionally it remains open, like a wound that never healed. What really happened that Christmas night remains an impossible puzzle. Perhaps the children perished, and the remains were simply never found. Or maybe someone planned a kidnapping executed under the perfect cover of chaos. The only certainty is that, since then, the Sodder house was never a home again, and Christmas 1945 became the epicenter of one of the most disturbing and saddest mysteries of the last century. The Hinterkaifeck Massacre. In the spring of 1922, in the frozen fields of southern Germany, a crime took place that still resists the passage of time, police logic, and the calm of oblivion. Isolated among the forests and meadows of Bavaria, halfway between the towns of Ingolstadt and Schrobenhausen, stood the farm known as Hinterkaifeck, a name that, since that year, would be etched into the German collective memory as a synonym for horror. There, in the silence of the night, 6 people were brutally murdered, one after another, with a cold and systematic violence that seemed more the work of a disturbed mind than a fleeting impulse. The most unsettling fact is that, 100 years later, The perpetrator has never been definitively identified. The scene, the clues, the suspicions, all remain suspended in the air like a photograph of human despair. The farm was inhabited by the Gruber family. Andreas Gruber, 63 years old, was the patriarch. His wife, Kazilia, was 72. They lived with their daughter Victoria Gabriel, 35, and their 2 grandchildren, Kazilia, 7, and Josef, a 2-year-old boy whose paternity had been, from the beginning, the subject of gossip and controversy in the community. Also living with them was a young domestic worker named Maria Baumgartner, who had started working at the farm just a few hours before being murdered. That final coincidence would be only one of the many pieces making up this rural enigma. Everything began, apparently, with small unsettling details that appeared days before the tragedy. Andreas Gruber had told neighbors that he found footprints in the snow leading from the forest to the house, but none returning. He also said he heard footsteps in the attic, although when checking, he found no one. A set of keys had mysteriously disappeared. The family felt that something was wrong, but instead of alerting the authorities, they chose to ignore it, or perhaps resign themselves. In a place as isolated as Hinterkaifeck, any sign of threat was, in itself, a sentence of vulnerability. On April 1, 1922, a few days after those ignored warnings, the inhabitants of the farm were killed in a staggered manner. According to later reconstruction, someone, probably someone already inside the house or who entered unseen, lured family members one by one to the barn. There, in the darkness, they were struck with an agricultural tool known as a hand axe. First Andreas, then his wife Kazilia, followed by Victoria and little Kazilia. The victims were attacked with such ferocity that some skulls were completely shattered. The most chilling fact is that the little girl showed signs of having survived briefly after the attack, as she had clumps of her own hair torn out by handfuls, as if she had been conscious while agonizing among the bodies of her family. Then the killer entered the house and killed Josef, who was sleeping in his cradle, and Maria Baumgartner, the maid, who was resting in her room. No evidence of a struggle or scuffle was found. There were no signs of robbery or missing valuables. The house remained in order, almost as if the killer wanted to maintain an illusion of normality. But the most disturbing was yet to come. Because, according to the evidence, the killer did not flee immediately after the crime. On the contrary, he stayed in the house. He lit the stove, fed the animals, took care of basic farm chores for at least 2 or 3 days, even chopped wood. Some villagers claimed to have seen smoke coming from the chimney days after the murders. That implied something few were willing to consider: that the killer was not only in no hurry to leave, but felt comfortable enough in that environment to inhabit it after committing a massacre. The bodies were discovered on April 4th, when neighbors noticed that the Grubers had not attended Mass, and little Kazilia had not shown up at school. Upon entering the house, they found such a brutal scene that even the most experienced investigators were shocked. The autopsies were performed on the farm itself, and the bodies were literally decapitated to facilitate forensic examination. The heads were sent to Munich but mysteriously disappeared during the Second World War, preventing any modern analysis afterward. That almost ghostly detail seemed to fit too well into a story full of loose ends. The investigation was extensive, but chaotic. At first, over 100 people were interrogated. Various hypotheses were considered: revenge, local feuds, crimes of passion, jealousy. One of the most persistent theories suggested that Josef's father was not a stranger, but Andreas Gruber himself, implying prolonged incest between him and his daughter Victoria. If true, the crime could have been motivated by a desire to punish or silence that abominable truth. However, although it was known that Andreas had been convicted years before for incest, it was never proven that Josef was his son. The father's identity remains unconfirmed, which further fuels the spiral of conjectures. Suspicions also fell on Victoria's former suitors. war deserters hiding in the woods, bandits, and even a serial killer who might have passed through the area. But no evidence was conclusive. For years, the locals said the killer must have been someone from the village, someone who knew the farm's routine and waited for their moment. And the most terrifying fact is that the killer probably returned to the community without raising suspicion. Perhaps he attended mass with the others, worked the fields, raised his children. He lived his life behind a mask of absolute normality. The case was reopened several times, even in the 21st century, with the use of modern forensic technology. The Bavarian police, in collaboration with criminology students, reanalyzed the evidence and concluded there was a prime suspect. However, the name was never publicly revealed, since the suspect's family was still alive and there was no possibility of taking the case to trial. The mystery, once again, was returned to the unsolved file. Today, the place where the Hinterkaifeck farm stood no longer exists. It was demolished shortly after the crime, for both practical and symbolic reasons. What remains is a gray monolith marking the spot where 6 lives were extinguished with a violence that seems ripped from a horror novel. A crime without resolution, without confession, without redemption. A puzzle that continues breathing in Germany's oral memory, in every new documentary, in every discussion among amateur investigators, and in every attempt to make sense of something that perhaps never had one. Because what happened at Hinterkaifeck was not just a multiple murder, it was an invisible fracture in the logic of everyday life, a rupture between the safety of the domestic and the intrusion of the incomprehensible. And perhaps that is why, after so much time, it still chills. Because it shows that pure horror needs no explanations, only an open door, a cold night, and a reason we may never understand. The disappearance of Maura Murray. Sometimes, mysteries do not begin with an obvious crime or a scene marked by chaos, but with a sequence of small, seemingly trivial acts that end up converging in an inexplicable absence. The disappearance of Maura Murray is a paradigmatic example of that type of story. There were no witnesses who saw a violent act, no bodies, no clear signs of struggle. Only a series of puzzling decisions made by a 21-year-old woman who, on an ordinary Monday, left in her car without telling anyone where she was going, had a minor accident on a lonely road in the state of New Hampshire, exchanged a few words with an occasional witness, and then disappeared forever. Maura was a nursing student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. She had good grades, a stable social circle, a family that loved her, and, at least on the surface, a life with direction. But when analyzing her last week, one begins to detect a restlessness that no one knew how to read in real time. Days before disappearing, she had a phone conversation with her sister that left her visibly upset. The sister would later declare that they talked about delicate family matters. That same night, Maura emotionally collapsed while working the night shift as a campus security guard. Her supervisor escorted her to her dorm room and gave her the rest of the night off. When asked what was wrong, she barely said, "My sister." Then came the preparations for her mysterious trip. Maura searched online for lodging in the White Mountains area of New Hampshire, a place she knew and where she had vacationed with her family. She called a cabin complex to make a reservation and then sent an email to her professors explaining she would be absent for several days due to a death in the family. That death never happened. No one in her circle was sick. No one had died. She also called her boyfriend, who lived out of state, and left him an apparently routine message. Then she packed. Clothes, books, toiletries, and also strange things for a short trip, like important personal documents and most of the cash she had available. She took her old black Saturn and headed north. On the afternoon of February 9, 2004, at approximately 7:27 p.m., Maura's car went off the road on a sharp curve on Route 112 near the town of Woodsville. A local resident heard the crash and called 911. Another neighbor, a retired school bus driver, approached the scene and found Maura apparently unharmed. The young woman reassured him, told him she had already called roadside assistance and that she did not need help. He returned to his home. Shortly after, when state police arrived, Maura was already gone. The car was partially blocking the road, the windshield broken, one of the tires damaged. There was a spilled bottle of wine and an open box of wine, along with a small amount of red stains that were never satisfactorily explained. The car was locked, but the keys and her mobile phone were missing. So was her backpack, which contained her most personal belongings. During the first days, the disappearance was treated as a case of a missing adult. In theory, Maura had the right to leave on her own. There were no clear signs of kidnapping, but as hours passed without a trace, the tone of the case changed. A massive search began in the area. Tracking dogs, helicopters, drones, rescue teams combed the nearby forests. The dogs lost the trail a few meters from the accident site, suggesting Maura had been picked up by another vehicle. But no clear evidence was found. No traffic cameras, no witnesses, no subsequent banking or phone activity. Investigators quickly delved into the days before her disappearance. They discovered Maura had had some disciplinary problems at university, including misuse of credit cards. She had a minor traffic accident just days before, and her academic record showed signs of stress. She had written a note to her boyfriend that was found in her room, but its content was never made public. For some, it was evidence of an emotional crisis. For others, it simply reflected the passing frustration of an overwhelmed student. Her family, especially her father, Fred Murray, took an unyielding stance from the start. Something had happened to Maura, and someone knew about it. Fred publicly pressured authorities, organized searches on his own, offered rewards, and denounced what he considered a lack of effective action by the state police. The relationship between the family and investigators became tense, which further fueled media coverage of the case. The public began to take massive interest, and over time, Maura Murray's case became one of the first viral true crime phenomena in the internet era. Forums appeared exclusively dedicated to discussing every detail. Obsessive communities formed that examined area maps, compared satellite images, analyzed the body language of interviewees in the few videos available. Every clue became a subject of debate. Every rumor, a possibility. Theories, as is predictable in these cases, quickly multiplied. Some believe Maura was a victim of a serial killer or a crime of opportunity. Others suggest she faked her disappearance to start a new life, perhaps escaping personal problems never fully revealed. There is also the hypothesis of an accident in the woods, which suggests that Maura, confused and scared after the crash, wandered into the thicket and died of hypothermia. But if that were true, why was no trace ever found? No garment, no object that confirmed that theory? Every proposed answer seems to open new questions, new voids. In subsequent years, multiple reports of sightings in different states, even in Canada, emerged. None were confirmed. In 2017, a house near the accident site was excavated after anonymous tips suggested Maura might have been buried there. Nothing conclusive was found. The investigation was reopened several times, and in 2021, it was announced that new tracking and forensic analysis technologies would be applied. So far, everything has been fruitless. Maura Murray's case represents in many ways the essence of the modern mystery. A disappearance without explicit violence, without concrete clues, without resolution. An incomplete puzzle, full of pieces that seem to fit until looked at more closely. The most painful thing for those who knew her is the total absence of closure. Not knowing if she died, if she was murdered, if she lives in hiding, if she needs help, or if she simply decided to leave everything behind for reasons we will never understand. Her face, that of a young woman with a serene expression and determined gaze, still appears on posters, documentaries, podcasts, and digital murals that seek to keep her story alive. And every anniversary of her disappearance renews the commitment of those who still believe that someday we will know what happened on that lonely stretch of Route 112. Because there is something particularly disturbing about cases where everything seems to begin just when someone disappears without a trace. The case of Kendrick Johnson. In the quiet town of Valdosta, Georgia, where school days unfold amid sports courts, orderly hallways, and predictable routines, on January 10, 2013, an event shattered the foundations of an entire community and, over time, the whole country. Kendrick Johnson, a 17-year-old African-American teenager, high school student, and promising athlete, was found dead inside a rolled-up wrestling mat in his school's gymnasium. He was face down, his body in a position impossible to explain without external help. What was initially presented as a tragic school accident soon turned into one of the most controversial, polarizing, and darkest cases in recent American justice history. Kendrick had been reported missing by his family the previous afternoon after he did not return home following classes. The next morning, while a group of students was walking through the Lowndes High School gym, one of them noticed a pair of socks sticking out from inside a vertical mat leaning against the wall. What they found upon investigation was a scene that seemed taken from a nightmare. Inside the canvas cylinder, with his feet up and his head pointing downward, lay Kendrick's lifeless body. His torso was bare. He wore pants down to his knees, and there was blood on his face. According to the initial report, the scene suggested that he had accidentally fallen while trying to reach a shoe at the bottom of the mat. That was the official explanation. A ridiculous accident, the result of a poor decision and extreme misfortune. But Kendrick's family, and later tens of thousands of people, did not believe it for a second. From the start, inconsistencies were abundant. The supposed accident had too many hard-to-accept elements. Kendrick was over 6 feet tall. The mat's diameter was narrow, and the space inside was tight and vertical. To fall into that position, he would have had to deliberately dive headfirst, at a precise angle, with no room to straighten or brace himself. Furthermore, why would he take off his shirt to reach a shoe? Why was that shoe not simply next to the mat like any lost object? And above all, why did no one hear or see anything in a public place during school hours? The official autopsy, performed by the Lowndes County Medical Examiner, concluded that the cause of death was positional asphyxia, a form of accidental suffocation caused by the inability to breathe due to the body's posture. According to this version, Kendrick became trapped, unable to move, and died slowly while hanging upside down. However, the Johnson family never accepted that explanation. From the beginning, they questioned the investigation, the slow pace of action, the apparent indifference of the school authorities, and the fact that surveillance camera footage had missing time lapses precisely during the period Kendrick was estimated to have entered the gym. Those cameras, which should have captured his last movements, showed interrupted images, gaps of several minutes, and a total absence of useful recordings at key points. When a technical review of those videos was requested, it was determined that the recording systems were not synchronized, which would explain the gaps, at least in theory. Unsatisfied, Kendrick's parents hired an independent pathologist, Dr. William Anderson, who conducted a second autopsy. What he found was disturbing. Anderson stated that the body showed signs of internal hemorrhaging incompatible with accidental death by asphyxia. He detected blunt trauma to the neck and injuries that, in his professional opinion, indicated Kendrick had been murdered. Additionally, a chilling fact was discovered that sparked public outrage. When the body was exhumed for this second autopsy, it was found that all the internal organs had been removed and replaced with newspaper. Yes, paper. Neither the lungs, nor the brain, nor the heart were in Kendrick's body. This was initially attributed to standard embalming procedures, but the family and their lawyers insisted that such practice was neither usual nor acceptable, especially without a clear explanation. Over time, alternative theories began to circulate. Some pointed to a school fight that got out of control. Two brothers, classmates of Kendrick, who reportedly had previous incidents with him and whose father worked as an FBI agent, were mentioned. Suspicion increased when it was learned these students were questioned but never formally charged, and there were no detailed records of their whereabouts during the alleged accident. Others suggested a cover-up operation to protect influential community members. Although these accusations have not been proven, the case became a symbol of a much broader demand: justice for a black family within a system perceived as biased, slow, and opaque. The Kendrick Johnson case became a national matter. It was covered by all major media outlets, discussed at protests, and even in Congress. Public pressure led the Department of Justice to open a federal investigation in 2014. But 3 years later, that investigation was closed without charges, citing insufficient evidence to support a criminal accusation. The frustration was devastating for the family, yet they did not stop. In 2021, a third investigation was opened, this time locally, after new affidavits and audio recordings emerged which, although unverified, suggested the possibility of a recorded confession. So far, no progress has been enough to change the official narrative. The Kendrick Johnson case remains unresolved, at least regarding judicial truth. But socially, in the collective conscience, it has already been settled. It is a symbol, an open wound in the conversation about race, justice, and power in the United States. It is the story of a family refusing to accept easy answers, of a community divided by silence, and of a system that often seems to operate by different rules, depending on who you are, where you are, and how much you can endure. The most unsettling thing is not only Kendrick's death, but the feeling that there are still hidden pieces, that someone knows more than they have said, that the official account is an incomplete version. And in that gap of uncertainty grows suspicion, pain leaks through, and mystery lives. Because it is not just about discovering what happened inside that gym, but understanding why so many voices were ignored, and why, after all this time, the truth remains out of reach. The Dyatlov Pass tragedy. Winter in the Ural Mountains is not merely a climatic phenomenon. It is an imposing presence, almost alive, that dominates everything it touches with its white silence and relentless cold. There, in a remote and seldom-traveled region of northern Soviet Union, one of the most baffling chapters in modern mystery history was written. 9 hikers, young, strong, and prepared, disappeared in February 1959 while undertaking a highly challenging ski trek in the Sverdlovsk region. What was found days later, when rescue teams finally reached the last camp, not only sowed confusion, but opened a chasm of questions that neither Soviet investigators, later scientists, nor mystery theorists have been able to close with certainty. The expedition was organized by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old student from the Ural Polytechnic Institute. He was accompanied by 8 companions, most also students, all with previous experience in extreme excursions and certified in winter sports. The group included Zinaida Kolmogorova, Yuri Doroshenko, Lyudmila Dubinina, Rustem Slobodin, Nikolai Thibault-Brignoles, Alexander Kolevatov, Yuri Krivonishenko, Semyon Zolotaryov, and a 10th member, Yuri Yudin, who left the expedition shortly after it began due to health problems. He was the only one to survive. None of the others returned alive. The planned route was demanding but theoretically safe for a group with their level of experience. The goal was to reach Mount Otorten, but due to adverse weather conditions, they ended up slightly off course on an unnamed slope, later named Dyatlov Pass in honor of the group leader. The last recorded contact was on February 1st. Days later, when the promised telegram signaling safe arrival was not received, family and friends began to worry. After a brief bureaucratic delay, Soviet authorities organized a search operation that took nearly 3 weeks to find the first sign. On February 26th, rescuers found the tent partially buried in the snow. The first thing that caught their attention was its condition. It was torn from the inside, as if the occupants had fled urgently without bothering to open the entrance. There were footprints of bare feet or socks descending toward the forest, moving away from the tent in single file. 2 bodies were found just over a kilometer away, next to the remains of an improvised fire. They were semi-naked despite the freezing temperatures and showed signs of hypothermia. A few hundred meters from there, 3 more bodies were found, including Dyatlov's. They appeared to have tried to return to the camp, crawling or barely walking. Weeks would pass before the thaw allowed the discovery of the last 4 hikers, buried under several meters of snow in a ravine. It was then that the case took on an even more sinister dimension. These bodies had much more severe injuries: skull fractures, broken ribs, internal bleeding, and one of them, Lyudmila Dubinina, was missing her tongue and eyes. The most baffling part was that these injuries did not appear caused by a fight or a single accident, but by an enormous force, as if they had been crushed. Forensic reports describe the violence as equivalent to a car accident. Yet, in most cases, there were no external signs of trauma on the skin. Theories began to proliferate immediately. One of the first explanations suggested that the group had been caught by an avalanche, which would justify their desperate flight and the structural damage. However, the slope's incline was not compatible with a conventional avalanche, and the tent was neither displaced nor completely buried. Furthermore, the footprints in the snow showed an orderly pattern, not chaotic. Another theory proposed that the hikers were victims of an extreme psychological reaction triggered by natural infrasound, a hypothesis based on the possible resonance of the wind passing through the mountains. Although suggestive, it did not explain the physical injuries. Secret military experiments were also mentioned. The region was not far from Soviet testing zones, and some investigators argued that the hikers might have been involuntary witnesses to a classified test. Records mention a strange orange sphere observed in the sky by other groups on the same date. Some suggest these lights could have been missiles, flares, or another type of device. Others even claim they were energy or radiation weapons. In fact, some of the bodies showed traces of radioactivity, although at inconclusive levels. The most speculative hypotheses crossed the boundaries of rationality. From attacks by an unknown wild creature to encounters with non-human intelligences. None were supported by evidence, but all found resonance in a cultural climate where Soviet secrecy only fueled suspicion. The KGB, which intervened in the investigation, classified many documents for decades. When part of the file was declassified, many found it incomplete, full of gaps, with undated photographs and contradictory testimonies. For years, the case hovered between mythology and the official archive. The lack of answers only deepened the mystery. Family members, survivors, and enthusiasts of the unexplained kept the memory of the 9 hikers alive, demanding a truth that never fully arrived. In 2019, the Russian government reopened the investigation. In 2020, a new conclusion was published: avalanche. It was based on modern simulations, snow behavior models, and an improved theory of partial tent collapse. But the scientific community and many independent experts still consider that response unsatisfactory. After all, it still does not explain why the bodies had such disproportionate injuries, or why they remained semi-naked at more than 20 degrees below zero without trying to return to the tent, without organizing a basic defense, without clear signs of collective struggle. The Dyatlov Pass tragedy is not only a story of death in the mountain. It is a window into the limits of human knowledge when faced with the unexpected. It is a tale where every clue becomes a fork in the road. Every answer generates new doubts, and the lack of living witnesses turns the case into an unsolvable equation. The most tragic aspect is not just the death of 9 talented young people, but the echo their silence left in the archives of history. An echo that still resonates with the same intensity as the glacial wind that blows through those deserted mountains. The Boy in the Box. On February 25, 1957, in a semi-wooded area of the Fox Chase neighborhood northeast of Philadelphia, a young man checking animal traps discovered an abandoned cardboard box. It was large, the kind typically used to ship cribs. Inside, wrapped in a worn-out blanket, lay the lifeless body of a small boy. He looked like a sleeping angel in an unusual pose, as if someone had gently arranged him after taking everything away. He was between 4 and 6 years old, visibly malnourished. His body showed signs of bruises, wounds, and recent cuts, and his hair had been hastily cut, possibly after his death. He was not wearing any clothes. There were no clear clues around him, just a box and a thick silence that, since that day, never stopped weighing on the city. The Philadelphia police launched an immediate investigation. Photographs of the boy, carefully arranged to show him as if he were sleeping, were distributed on thousands of posters throughout the region. Images were placed on gas receipts, in stores, stations, newspapers, and even inside bank envelopes. He became known as the Boy of America, but the media, and later history, would remember him as the boy in the box. Despite the enormous effort to identify him, no one claimed him. No missing person reports matched his description. No family member, guardian, neighbor, or institution came forward looking for him. It was as if he had never existed, as if the boy had been ripped from the world in total and cruel anonymity. For decades, theories multiplied like echoes of the same anguish. A private investigator linked the case to a family from southern New Jersey, based on the testimony of a woman known as M, who claimed that her mother had bought or received the boy as part of an illegal arrangement, subjected him to abuse, and finally killed him in a fit of rage. The story included details partially matching the crime scene: the blanket, the haircut, the location. However, the forensic experts could not verify any of the facts, and the story was eventually filed as a lead without legal substance. The case froze in time, like a postcard of horror with no delivery address. For more than 60 years, the detectives who inherited the Boy in the Box file worked with the resignation of someone facing a puzzle with pieces that do not fit. Over the decades, a parallel story was built, that of investigators, journalists, genealogists, and ordinary citizens obsessed with giving a name to that face. The boy's grave, initially marked as Unknown Boy, was visited every year. There were always flowers, toys, candles, prayers. It was as if the city had adopted him in its tragedy. As if, having no one to mourn him in life, everyone wanted to assume that role in his death. Everything began to change thanks to advances in forensic genetics. Starting in 2019, the Philadelphia Police Department, in collaboration with the Othram Inc. Laboratory, began using reverse genetic genealogy techniques to create a profile of the boy using DNA extracted from a bone sample preserved for decades. The process was slow, difficult, and full of technical obstacles. But the genetic code held secrets that neither time nor silence could erase. In December 2022, the police announced they had identified the boy in the box. His name was Joseph Augustus Zarelli, born on January 13, 1953. He was 4 years old at the time of his death. He belonged to a family with roots in the Philadelphia area, and although both parents had already died, there were still living relatives. The identification was possible thanks to the construction of a family tree that traced branches until finding matches with possible distant relatives who had submitted their DNA to commercial databases, such as GED Match. It was a milestone for forensic genealogy, and also an emotional turning point for the city's most painful case. However, despite having given him a name, the tragedy is far from over. The police have not revealed who killed him or how exactly he died. They claim the investigation remains open. The discovery of the name reshapes the narrative but also raises new questions that hurt even more. How is it possible that a boy with a surname and an address was completely forgotten by those who were supposed to care for him? Who kept silent for so long? How many people knew? And why did they keep that secret for 6 decades? At the same time, more details emerged. Joseph had been born out of wedlock in a complicated family context. Some media reported that his birth had been registered in secret and that, for that reason, there were never formal missing person reports. It is unknown whether he lived with his biological parents, with a relative, or if he was given to another family through unofficial channels. That part of his life is shrouded in an impenetrable shadow. Neither civil records, family chronicles, nor recovered testimonies managed to create a clear picture of the last days of that boy. What we do know is that Joseph was beaten, abandoned, and that his body was treated with a sinister mixture of coldness and care. He was wrapped in a blanket and placed with strange tenderness in a box. Whoever left him there did not just throw him away randomly. They put him in a place where he would eventually be found, as if wanting to silence him, but also making sure he would not be lost completely. Perhaps out of guilt, perhaps out of fear, perhaps out of distorted love. We will never know. The story of Joseph Augustus Zarelli is the synthesis of what moves and frightens the most in unsolved mysteries. Interrupted childhood, denied identity, prolonged injustice. For more than 60 years, he was a case number, a forensic drawing, a yellowed file. Today he has a name. He has a grave with a surname. He has a story, although still fragmentary. But above all, he has memory. And that, for those who work to unravel the inexplicable, is the first step toward a form of justice. Because when someone dies and no one asks about them, when a child disappears from the world's record without leaving a trace, the greatest crime is not only the one who killed him. The greatest crime is forgetting, and that at least no longer has a place in Joseph's story. If any of these stories made you think, leave it in the comments. I want to read you. And if you want to keep exploring mysteries as real as they are disturbing, subscribe and turn on the notification bell. There is much more to tell, and still too many unanswered questions. Good night.